Chapter 852. If you have a monthly vote, please vote for Blackie's new book, Calamity Descends. He's not far from the top 6. Thank you for your help. The pages of the paper fluttered in the dark night, and the cold autumn wind blew through the empty streets. The notice about the attack by unknown bandits in the Tosankard mining area 3 months ago seemed to be pulled by an invisible hand. It flapped its wings like a butterfly on the bulletin board, along with a few other wanted posters. The militia and the guards were running around the streets like headless flies. Chaotic shouts and sharp whistles resounded throughout the town in the night. The bell on the steeple of the Holy Cathedral in the center of the town finally rang. The nightmares of the night were like an omen of uneasiness, shrouding everyone's heads in an instant. However, in the midst of the panic, there were still people who treated it coldly. Chanali was wearing the uniform of the White Wing Cavalry Regiment. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall outside the city hall, coldly looking at a young couple who were parting not far away. "Ronnie, take this with you. I heard that places like Svenfano are very cold. You'll need it." A young man wearing the uniform of the guards stuffed a thick fur coat into the hands of the girl in the carriage with a concerned look. Most of the people in the carriage were gloomy and silent. Only the girl's face was pale. She grabbed the young man's hand tightly and asked, "Evan, aren't you coming with us?" The young man smiled and said, "Ronnie, I'm a member of the guards. I'm under the command of Her Highness the Princess. I swear to be loyal to this kingdom and the future king. It's my responsibility to protect this land and everyone. Don't be stubborn. I'll meet up with you soon." He unsheathed his sword, and the gleaming blade sent a chill down everyone's spine. "My swordsmanship is one of the best in the guards. Those skeletons are nothing to be afraid of. Ronnie, just you wait. I'll make a name for myself just like the Breton Knight and Count Tonagel." The girl pursed her lips as she looked at him. Another hurried whistle sounded from the other end of the street, and the boy turned back to take a look. He quickly turned back and patted the girl's hand. "The instructor is rushing us. Wait for me at Svenfano. Don't worry, it's just a few scattered Madara troops. Their main force is still at Bucci on the other side of the mountain. The white-winged cavalry has already told us that this battle is not a big deal." The girl then nodded with tears in her eyes. Shanali watched for a while and felt a little bored. He glanced at his companion who was leading her horse and his horse out of the courtyard of the city hall. He immediately asked, "Captain, did you persuade them? Those short-sighted bastards." The female knight curled her lips and replied coldly. Shanali knew that she had persuaded them, but the process of persuasion was not pleasant. They were a bunch of short-sighted bastards who only cared about the benefits in front of them. He agreed with this point, but they were the same. No one had ever said that the men of the Vermeer Legion were righteous. On the contrary, they had a bad reputation. He grabbed the saddle and mounted the horse. At the same time, he swept his hand behind him so that his cloak and the sword hanging at his waist would not fall to the side of the horse's back. He turned his head and saw Rosa doing the same. Both of them were veteran riders who had experienced the tragic battle a year ago. Shanali still remembered the scene when he charged into the endless sea of skeletons. In the dark night, as far as the eye could see, there was only a sea of flickering phosphorescence. Such a magnificent scene sent chills down his spine. It was said that in that battle, many people were stabbed to death by spears because they slowed down in fear. But after familiarizing themselves with the battle with Madara, people gradually realized that the strength of the skeletons was not much. The strength of the skeletons was far inferior to that of an adult. However, the army that did not know fear, fatigue, and retreat left a deep impression on him. Shanali touched the scar on his cheek and asked, "Where are we going?" "To rendezvous with our troops." Rosa grabbed the reins, clamped the horse's belly slightly, and took the lead in trotting out. Shanali had no choice but to follow. But suddenly, a sharp whistle swept over their heads, shaking the roof tiles on both sides of the street and causing them to fall down. He raised his head subconsciously. Ivan grabbed his sword and was running towards the rendezvous point. The sudden whistle made the youth stop in his tracks. He looked up in shock. In the vast night sky to the south of the town, countless specks of light were slowly rising. These specks of light rose into the air, gathered into a ball, and then suddenly scattered like a flock of birds. At that moment, the youth finally understood what it was. Hide! A shrill scream came from somewhere. The sky was filled with arrows that fell like raindrops. There were still some pedestrians on the street who were fleeing north, but now they fell like wooden stakes under the rain of arrows. The cold arrows that had been tempered by magic pierced through the fragile human bodies. The soul fire on the arrows burned fiercely as if it was on fire. In the blink of an eye, The victims were turned into human figures struggling in the flames. Only a small number of people with fast reflexes managed to survive, and Ivan was one of them. The long-term training of the guards ultimately saved his life. He didn't even know how he reacted, and when he came back to his senses, his body was already lying in front of a pottery workshop. He looked up numbly and saw that the signboard hanging in front of the workshop had been pierced by several arrows. It was slowly being engulfed by the blue flames. What happened? He turned around and saw a patch of weeds suddenly growing on the flagstone streets. It was the tail feathers of arrows, corpses, residents who were scared to the point of collapse, and burning wreckage. It was as if the entire town had turned into a scene from hell in an instant. Evan looked at all of this with his mouth agape. At this moment, a second shriek swept across the sky above the town, causing the ground to tremble slightly. In his vision, a winged creature that he had never seen before flapped its wings and flew up to the steeple of the holy temple in the center of the town. The Knight Captain Gage of the White-Winged Cavalry 7th Squadron froze there. He wanted to grab his commander's sword several times, but he could not grab it. Less than 100 meters in front of him, countless skeletal arms were lifting up the soil and reaching out from the ground. Then came skulls with phosphorescent eye sockets, then collarbones, shoulder armor, and the entire upper body. Countless skeletons were climbing out from the ground one after another. They shook off the dirt on their black nether steel chainmail. With longbows in hand, they stood up one by one and walked forward to a predetermined position. They then raised their longbows. The arrows on the longbows were burning with a faint flame. It was as if in an instant, a complete formation of longbow archers had appeared in front of him. Almost all the knight beside Gage were at a loss. Because when they looked around, this scene was not just happening in front of them. It was happening everywhere in the front of the Silman Valley. Under the night sky, the phosphorescent light on the arrows of the skeleton archers formed a continuous belt of light. This belt of light stretched from west to east. There was no end in sight. But the crux of the problem was, where did they come from? Where were the scouts? Where did they die? How did these damn skeletons get around the defensive line? Could it be that it came from underground? Everyone's heart was filled with these questions. But to Gage, these questions had converged into one main problem. What to do? When the second wave of arrows rained down from the sky, the White-Winged Cavalry's Vice Captain Walter finally reacted. He finally realized that this was not some harassment. Even during the War of the Black Rose, he had never seen so many skeleton archers. The Dark Lords of Madara liked to divide their army into small squads, each squad commanded by their own. Normally, a squad of liches would command 10 to 12 skeletons. It depended on the number of liches and Black Knight under the Dark Lord's command. This kind of battle style was like a knight leading his squires into battle. Only in large-scale battles would one see hundreds and thousands of liches commanding tens of thousands of skeletons to charge forward like a tsunami. That was the scene that the human army was most afraid of. But fortunately, this kind of opportunity was rare even for the Roman Black Rose. First of all, gathering thousands of liches was a difficult matter. It required the cooperation of many Dark Lords to accomplish it. But this was precisely the hardest thing to happen in Madara. So when Walter saw thousands of skeleton archers on the long line of battle, his first reaction was that he had been fooled. There were at least 3 to 4 Dark Lords fighting side by side, and they were working together seamlessly. At this time, even if he was stupid, he would have realized that Sealman's path, which looked more difficult to attack, was precisely Madara's main direction of attack. After realizing this, he immediately thought, what should I do now? How should I resolve this battle? Can I still resolve it? The only thing he was thankful for was that he was commanding the cavalry. Compared to Madara's regular skeleton warriors, the cavalry at least had the advantage of mobility and impact. Although Madara had Black Knight as well, they were too few in number. They could not play a decisive role in this battle. The deputy commander quickly calmed down. Madara's attack was too sudden. These damned skeletons suddenly appeared from the ground and appeared in front of them almost instantly. There was no time to react at all, and a brigade of his cavalry was finished. Although the cavalry was not completely annihilated in the beginning, but they were scattered around the battlefield. There was almost no organization between them and they were not connected at all. Soon they would lose the will to fight. Walter was very familiar with his own men, so he did not expect any miracle to happen. But he still had 2 brigades. That was enough. Dispatch. He finally made up his mind and shouted. One order after another was relayed amidst the chaos. When the remaining 2 cavalry clans in the Silverman Valley gathered to launch an assault on the skeletal archers' left flank, just as Walter had predicted, the first clan of the White-Winged Cavalry had fallen into utter chaos. The 1st Brigade's Knight commander, the gold-ranked Great Knight Garen, was shot in the eye socket by the first wave of arrows and died on the spot. Then, the skeleton army suddenly crawled out from the ground and directly dragged the 1st Brigade into the chaos. The battle had only lasted for half an hour, and the 4th Squadron was completely annihilated. The 7th Squadron's Knight Captain Gage was killed, and the 8th Squadron's Knight Captain Opum was seriously injured and unconscious. The remaining Supreme Commander fell to the head of the 8th Squadron's Vice Captain, Portland. This person did not have much of a mind of his own, so he simply led his troops to retreat to Owl Town. Thus, Madara's army was completely unobstructed. The remaining 2 cavalry brigades were instantly exposed to the enemy's attacks. When Walter saw this scene from the high ground, he was so angry that he wanted to curse. In his heart, he had already dragged Opum out and beheaded him many times. Unfortunately, his anger was useless now. It was too late to withdraw the order now. He could only hope that Madara's reaction was not that fast, and they could not change the direction of the battlefield in such a short time. Or perhaps, his men were better and could withstand 1 or 2 waves of attacks. As long as they could kill their way into the skeleton archers' camp, then the rest would be easy. They were cavalry and the enemy was just infantry. If this was the War of the Black Rose, perhaps the white-winged cavalry would have already collapsed. Fortunately, it had been a year since the war, and this year was enough for everyone who had experienced that terrible war to lick their wounds. Those terrible undead were now just ugly skeletons in the hearts of the veterans, and they were no longer synonymous with death. Other than being dull and fearless, they were even worse than ordinary human soldiers. Without the fear that originated from the root, the Roman Tuo's Black Rose was just a slightly special opponent. Walter thought of this and pursed his lips. Bless Martha. Time has not only changed Madara, he thought silently in his heart. And it was indeed so. Balls of illumination magic exploded on the battlefield, illuminating the hundreds and thousands of cavalrymen and the last distance between them and the skeleton army of Madara. Among the slowly advancing cavalrymen, mages flew up from behind the knight one after another, leaving the back of their horses and floating in the air. Although their spells would expose the white-winged cavalry to the range of the skeleton archers, the cavalrymen were preparing for the final sprint. It was almost impossible to carry out such a tactic in the dark. Although legend said that some cavalrymen might be able to do it, the commanders of the white-winged cavalry knew that their men were capable of it. The Knight Captain Vance of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade felt that the good lads on horseback were overtaking him one after another. In fact, the entire 2nd Cavalry Brigade was in a state of acceleration. About 100 meters away was the 1st Cavalry Brigade. The cavalrymen under Valerie's command were a little ahead of them. Their task was to open a path in the sea of skeletons so that they could slaughter the necromancers behind them. Vance suddenly felt his body become lighter. This was a sign that a wind spell had taken effect on him and his horse. Thanks to all kinds of strange magic, the cavalrymen were able to charge in such a rugged terrain at night. These tactics were summed up in the War of the Black Rose. Before that, the kingdom's army had been following the experience gained from the First Holy War. They were conservative and old-fashioned and in fact were not suitable for war. War was fair to both sides. The Madara in front of them might be stronger than before, but they were not the same. Just wait and see, damn skeletons. He waved his long sword excitedly. Cavalry tactics were the greatest invention in the history of civilization. When you personally participated in it, you would be surrounded by horses and armored knights with swords in their hands. When all of these formed an irresistible torrent of steel forward, every participant felt as if they were personally controlling this extraordinary power. It was an addictive feeling. For Vance it made no difference. The rain of arrows began, clanking as they fell on the armor, but it did not cause any damage. The horses of the cavalrymen were not close relatives of the draft horses, and the tamed monsters were closer to the unicorns in terms of bloodline. Although they were not as powerful as their relatives in the forest, they were still far stronger than ordinary beasts. Therefore, after the impact of the arrows was reduced by the thick armor, the impact of the arrows was transmitted to them was negligible. The knight at the front had begun to let out strange cries. At this distance, it was time to prepare for the lich's spells. However, the mages at the back were also ready to attack. This was the last hurdle. Once they broke through, the skeleton army would be in front of them. In the War of the Black Rose, not many armies dared to face the sea of skeletons head-on. But now it was different. The mysterious cloak that was draped over the army had long faded due to the accumulation of time after the war. Especially for the veterans who had participated in the First War, the skeletons in front of them were just skeletons. New and old grudges were in front of them. They held their breath and wanted to teach the enemy a lesson. The lower-ranking officers were also shouting to encourage the new recruits. Everyone understood one thing. They were cavalry and the other party was only infantry. Regardless of whether the charge failed or not, infantry would not be able to pursue the cavalry. The only thing to worry about was not being held back. There was also the Black Knight. But fortunately, the skeleton army was scattered, and the enemy's commander did not seem to have much experience. Anne Vance did not see the shadow of the Black Knight. The Black Knight and his nightmare horse were very conspicuous in such an environment, and there was no need to worry about where they would hide. The whole valley was open, and the nearest hill was 1,000 meters away. There was no need to worry about them suddenly appearing. Vance looked around and finally breathed a sigh of relief. The only thing that puzzled him was the expected magic attack did not come. What's the commander of Madara doing? He was a little puzzled and could not help but raise his head to look in Valerie's direction. They're about to miss their last chance. Chapter 853. Once again, I'm trying to get monthly votes for Blackie's new book, Calamity Descends. What's the commander of Madara doing? Valerie, the knight captain of the 1st Cavalry Brigade, was also thinking about this question. She looked up and saw that the skeleton army was doing something strange on the other side of the battlefield. The army was slowly turning around, but their movements were so slow that they looked like a dying old man. It was almost impossible for them to turn around and attack before the cavalry arrived. Madara's left wing was still directly threatened by Erwin's 2 cavalry brigades. Valerie could even tell that even if her attack passed through them, they would not be able to turn around in time to surround them. This was a great opportunity. However, Valerie saw that the skeleton army was spreading out, as if deliberately making a path for her. If this scene happened to a human army, then according to the description in the cavalry manual, the enemy would have already collapsed, and the only thing left to do was to drive them forward like ducks. However, the female knight captain had a strong sense of vigilance in her heart, because in front of her was an army of the undead, and it was impossible for the undead to collapse in morale, unless something happened to the necromancers who were driving the skeletons behind. Could it be that someone was attacking the Madara army from behind? Just as this thought flashed through her mind, something suddenly appeared in her field of vision, and it immediately made her heart sink. She saw that behind the opening, a few tall figures suddenly appeared. They were not the clumsy corpse monsters or the crusaders, nor were they the Black Knight with a burning soul fire under their armor. They were some strange riders like skeletons riding on horseback. They were covered in heavy black mail armor and wielded long spears. The war horses under them were also bony, and their whole body was covered in tattered armor. At first, a few of these riders appeared, but as the opening became bigger and bigger, their numbers gradually became terrifying. Valerie's eyes widened in surprise. She saw a whole cavalry behind the dense skeleton archers. It was definitely not the Black Knight because it was impossible for there to be so many Black Knights. The skeleton riders were next to each other and the front was almost a mile wide. It was dark and gloomy like a city wall. Slow down and change direction. Valerie's heart felt as if it had been pierced by a sharp needle. She suddenly understood what it was, the skeleton knight. Madara had a new type of troop that they had never seen before. Suddenly, a sharp whistle sounded from the other side of the battlefield. Valerie glanced over and knew that Vance had also seen those strange riders. Their reactions were very fast. Although they didn't know how strong their opponents were, one thing was certain. They had more people than them and a lot more. If the skeletal riders were able to keep up with them, it would be a disaster for the White-Winged Cavalry Regiment even if they were extremely weak. This was because even though they were sharp, they were also weak. Once they were held back by the tens of thousands of skeletons, there would only be one outcome. That was to be defeated and turned into one of those monsters. After losing their cavalry in the Grimoire's Passage, there would be no defensive forces from the Silverman Valley to Kirkle. This meant that the entire Grimoire's Passage was open to Madara. Valerie was drenched in cold sweat. She didn't dare to imagine what the outcome would be. It was almost a replica of the War of the Black Rose, and it might even be worse because the Southern Legion was still in Ampere Seal. If the Grimoire's Passage failed, only Karsuk would be left in the Southern Territory. The White-Winged Cavalrymen were clearly aware of their situation. These experienced riders turned around one after another. The 2 cavalrymen turned extremely quickly on the battlefield, but in Valerie's eyes, it was so slow that it made her anxious. She saw the skeleton riders start to speed up, and the whole army was so uniform that it looked like a huge machine. At this time, the female knight captain finally realized how terrifying this cavalry unit was. Then she thought of another bad news, which was that this cavalry unit might be like the Black Knight. They didn't have to worry about the endurance of the war horses. Her heart suddenly turned cold. At this time she could only place her hopes on Walter's command. But what made her very uneasy was why the commander still hadn't given the order to retreat. Was he planning to bury the entire white-winged cavalry unit here just to prove how terrifying Madara's army was? Valerie anxiously turned her head and looked at the hills in the north, hoping to see the expected signal. Unfortunately, the north was silent. At this time, a sharp whistle suddenly swept across the sky above the battlefield. Everyone couldn't help but look up and see strange flying creatures flying over their heads. The town was in a sea of fire. Looking around, there were blue flames burning everywhere. Other than that, there were also the destroyed white-winged cavalry unit or the garrison's temporary defense line on the streets. There were corpses everywhere wearing the militia uniform, the white-winged cavalry uniform, or the same garrison uniform as him. The only thing they all had in common was that they were all covered in blood and had stopped breathing. Ivan's gaze only lingered on these corpses for a short while before he slowly walked past these areas. A small group of garrison members were following behind him. He had just learned that their instructor had died in the hands of the monster that flew to the church steeple first. And he also knew that the monster's name was Dreadwraith. But there was even worse news. It was said that Butchie's 1st Cavalry unit had been completely destroyed in the street battle. Commander Portland had also been killed. Now the 1st Cavalry unit only existed in name. The remaining people were like the people following them. They didn't have the will to fight, and the only thought left was to survive. Just a moment ago they were filled with passion and wanted to fight for Erwin. But although the ideal was beautiful, the reality was too cruel for them to accept. They were almost immediately taught a cold lesson. The only thing that made Ivan feel a little relieved was that Ronnie's carriage had already left the town before the battle began. It was said that the white-winged cavalry was fighting outside the town, so she and the rest of the family should be able to reach Svenfano safely. But what would happen after that even he himself didn't know. There were so many skeletons in Madara, and the town was almost filled with those monsters. Now the young man was very doubtful that they could defend the town. The group of people were like fleeing beggars as they walked out of the unfamiliar town. They didn't go far before they were stopped. There was a fierce battle happening on the only street leading out of the town. Ivan quickly identified the two sides of the battle should be Madara's skeletons and the town's militia. It was basically a one-sided massacre. When they arrived, there was no one alive on the scene. The Lich was awakening the fresh corpses. The soldiers who were fighting for Erwin a moment ago were swinging their swords at them with blood all over their bodies. It's Rala and the others. They're all dead. One of the guards said with a pale face. Ivan's expression changed as well. These militia were the townspeople that he usually saw all the time. But now they had turned into something else. He couldn't help but glance at the sneaky Lich on the other side of the street and clenched his teeth. How unlucky, there's a Lich. Vice Captain Ma Dong spat and pulled out his sword. We have to think of a way to kill it so we can continue moving forward. You guys think of a way to attract the attention of those monsters. I'll go cut that guy. The Lich's power is on its staff. As long as I can catch it off guard and cut off its arm, then this battle should be easy. Ivan looked at him and felt that he wasn't so optimistic. Be careful. He reminded. Pay attention to this area. There were at least 3 to 4 small groups of militia. This is the only way out of the town. They're in charge of covering the rear. So what? The instructor told us that a Lich can lead 10 to 12 skeletons. Can't kill so many people. That's not necessarily true. Ma Dong shook his head. These militia have no fighting power in this situation. They're not professional soldiers like us. Ivan saw that Ma Dong didn't listen, so he could only shut up. He turned around and gestured to the others, indicating that they should attack together with him to attract the Lich's fighting power. The distance between the two sides was less than 50 meters. In fact, he wasn't too worried about a head-on battle because they had more people. The Lich could only summon 2 or 3 corpses in a short time. Ma Dong was right. The militia's fighting power in this kind of situation was greatly reduced. Sometimes they could even be killed by a few skeletons because they were already scared out of their wits. But the skeleton archers hidden in the burning building caused them a lot of trouble. Almost half of their casualties were caused by these 2 skeleton archers. Fortunately, although the battle wasn't going well, at least the Lich's subordinates fell one by one. At this time, Ma Dong finally seized the opportunity. He quietly passed through the shadows of the other side of the building and approached the Lich without anyone noticing. But when he pulled out his sword and was about to make the final strike, a sudden change occurred. Ma Dong, be careful. Ivan suddenly shouted. He was worried about Ma Dong's plan, so he was always paying attention to that direction. When he saw that Ma Dong was about to make a move, a black shadow suddenly fell from the sky. This scene was too familiar. That was how their instructor had died. Ma Dong reacted at the last moment, but this deputy captain of the guards had no time to react at all. With a loud crash, a gigantic creature had already descended from the sky, bringing countless tiles with it as it landed on him. It grabbed his shoulder and its sharp claws pierced through his collarbone and shoulder armor, lifting him up from the ground. Ma Dong let out a painful scream. At this time, the others finally saw the monster's appearance. It looked a little like a shrunken skeleton dragon. His body was made of only bones and no skin. On its huge head, there were a pair of burning soul flames in its eye sockets, like two pillars of light. It had sharp teeth. The only difference between it and the skeleton dragon was that it had a sharp beak at the front of its mouth. Phallus. Someone screamed as he recognized the monster, but that was not enough to save Ma Dong. The Ju Ling pecked at the vice-captain's head, crushing it into pieces. The vice-captain spasmed, and his whole body collapsed like a deflated balloon. The phallus pecked Ma Dong to death and threw the body away. Then it looked up at the others and let out a terrifying scream. Ivan felt a chill run through his body and his mind went blank. But the others around him reacted faster. One of the guards screamed and turned to run. But before he could run a few steps, a green light hit him in the back. His whole body swelled up and exploded into a bloody mist. This scene woke everyone up. There was still a necromancer here. And it was not to be underestimated. Evan could only watch as the monster raised the bone staff at him. He wanted to dodge, but he could not move his body even a single step. Ronnie? Chanali silently closed Rosa's eyes. In her last moments, the female knight's eyes were staring straight at the sky. The lich had opened a large hole in her chest. Her original appearance could no longer be seen. All that was left was a mess of flesh and blood. He didn't say a word. He took off his uniform and covered her with it. They had known each other for a long time. They had experienced the War of the Black Rose together, and even participated in a few major battles. They were also veterans in the cavalry regiment, so they had the rank of sergeant. They thought this was just a small border conflict, but they didn't expect to be separated by life and death here. Although he had experienced a lot of life and death separations in the past year, he still felt a little uncomfortable at this moment. There were new types of soldiers among the skeletons, such as the phallus. They had only appeared in the battlefield of Karsuk before. Why would they suddenly appear in the Dark Lord's army in the south of Buchi? The number of necromancers was also much rarer. If it wasn't for the fact that there was another necromancer behind the necromancer and the phallus, Rosa wouldn't have died. Chanali wanted to curse out loud. What the hell were those damn scouts doing? He looked at Rosa's face and carefully studied it for a while. Then he slowly walked through the street. The street was full of broken corpses. Some of them were still intact, but there were 1 or 2 arrows stuck in their bodies. But he suddenly stopped. He saw a familiar face among the corpses. It was one of the young couple he had seen before. Pitiful worm. He thought, but still walked over. It's fate. At least you can die with dignity. He wanted to drag the boy's body down from the ruins. But when he held the boy's hand, he was shocked. There was warmth and a pulse. He's not dead yet. He suddenly reacted and hurriedly pulled the young man down. Then he slapped his face with all his might. When Ivan regained consciousness, the first thing he saw was Shanali's blood-stained face. He remembered that he had seen this man before. He was standing with a female knight at the entrance of the city hall with an arrogant look on his face. I didn't expect you to die too, he replied in a daze. Dye your head, idiot. Chanali slapped him. Get up now. You're lucky. If you still want to see your little girlfriend, you better get up. I'm not dead. Evan seemed to wake up. Really? Tears flowed down his face uncontrollably. Chanali looked at the useless kid lying there in tears and couldn't help but want to kick him. But after hesitating for a while, he sighed and turned to look at Rosa. All right, you're a man. Show some courage. He reached out and pulled the boy up. There's no one left in the town. You know the way, right? Take us away from this damned place. Evan looked at him in a daze and hurriedly nodded. Valerie understood that the White-Winged Cavalry Regiment was finished. But she still didn't understand why the deputy commander didn't react at all. Unless he had already escaped, but that was almost impossible. She looked on helplessly as the skeleton horseman pierced its own chest with its spear. All the strength in her body seemed to have left her body. She raised her head with difficulty and looked around. The skeleton horseman's corpses were piled up in layers around her. But unfortunately it was meaningless. I'm going to become one of them, she thought. Vance was dead and so was Valerie. The remaining white-winged cavalrymen were scattering, but countless fear wraiths were killing their hopes of escape. The entire battlefield was now a horrifying picture. Specks of soul fire were pushing forward, and the skeleton army was chasing the remaining humans away. But they would eventually be caught because whether it was warhorses or humans, they would never be a match for the undead in a competition of endurance. Evan stared at the scene in a daze. He had thought that the catastrophe in the town was just a part of the war. But now it seemed that there was no more war and only a massacre was left. Shanali's face was also gloomy. The white-winged cavalry regiment was finished. He knew this better than Evan, but he didn't understand why the battle had turned out like this. At least the 2nd and 3rd Brigade should have been able to escape. Even in the worst-case scenario, the 3rd or 2nd Cavalry Brigade would be left behind to cover the retreat, and at least one cavalry brigade would be able to escape. But now it was all over. He could almost imagine that the only path left for Madara's army was the passage to Grinoires. The southern border was completely destroyed. Even the two of them might not be able to escape alive from the undead creatures that covered the mountains and plains. What should we do? Evan looked at the knight and couldn't help but ask in a low voice. The warhorse he was sitting on was Rosa's. He was not used to riding, but he had to get used to the current situation. Fortunately, he had learned horsemanship when he was in the garrison. Otherwise he would have been tied to the horse. Go east, Shanali said in a low voice. The hills to the east are our only chance. There are still some bandits there. Hopefully they will take us in, Shanali replied grimly. Bandits and bandits. Evan subconsciously looked in that direction. He remembered that there was a group of them, but they were the main problem for the militia and the patrolling cavalry. They had little to do with the garrison. They seem to be from Tosankard. They are real desperados. Will they take us in? He couldn't help but ask. Bandits or undead, you choose? Bandits, the young man answered without hesitation. Chapter 855. The Silman River Valley had already been reduced to a land of ashes. The night was still dark. Under the moonlight, the undead army had split into several groups as they marched along the rolling hills. Looking down along the riverbank, Owl Town was only left with scattered ruins and remains. Countless skeletons circled around the town, and monotonous cracking sounds echoed in the wilderness. Between the long lines, corpses were piled high. The liches were picking out the intact corpses and reviving them into warriors. The cold night wind blew from the direction of the mountain pass. It seemed to carry the eerie incantations that they chanted, making the atmosphere of the valley even more creepy. The blood staff stood alone in the night wind, still letting the cold wind tug at the corner of its ghoul robe. It glanced at a mutilated corpse not far away. It should be a human militia. Judging from the wound, he should have died at the hands of the Dreadwraiths. Only half of his body was left. His hand was still holding a sharp rock on the ground. The blood staff could imagine that he must have struggled to break free before he died, but the Dreadwraiths tore his body apart with their sharp claws and fangs. It raised its head again and looked at the valley. The battle in the valley had already ended. There was not a single living creature in sight. There was only dead silence. It was a perfect victory. It was as if it had witnessed the prophecy of the Dark Prophecy, that the kingdom of darkness in the east would rise. Those pathetic Erewhon bastards. They must not understand why they lost so badly. Behind the blood staff, a young man with a face as pale as a corpse smiled, showing his white teeth. He did not have fangs, nor did he have the ghastly fire in his eyes like the Black Knight. There were no psychic runes on his body, and he was not a necromancer. He was wearing a neat black suit as if he had just returned from a funeral. He took a deep breath. The taste of magic in the land is so fragrant. If it was in the Sea of the Dying Moon, only a real lord would have the right to own such a territory. He looked at the blood staff again and shook his head regretfully. I really don't understand why you can't defeat such weak opponents. I don't understand. But such lowly fellows do not have the right to own such good land. This kingdom will only be left with tombstones and graveyards. The blood staff snorted coldly. These dark lords came from the Dead Moon Sea. It was said that in the east, where magic was barren, the strife between necromancers was even more ruthless. That was the land of 4 wars. However, these unruly fellows were indeed very powerful. The necromancers there invented a spell to extract half-corporeal and half-spiritual dreadwraiths from the pterosaur corpses, and a way to let necromancers command skeleton knights. Their addition of... I heard that there is a White Lion Legion in the north of the human kingdom. I wonder how strong they are. The young man turned around and asked. There used to be, but they were defeated by the Southern Legion. I heard that the little princess dismembered her brother's army. Today the Legion is only in name to this kingdom. Erwin's civil war between the North and the South had ended less than 4 months ago. The Bloodstaff was not very clear about the details of the war. Even so, there were still many rumors about the losers who experienced the war that flowed into the Dark Kingdom. He chose to believe the story that most of the Dark Lords agreed with. Then it's not worth mentioning. The young man's scornful tone was carried far away by the night wind. Overhead, under the starry night, a dreadwraith was whistling through the night sky. Behind it, there were dozens of monsters spreading their wings. Each of them was like a floating shadow sweeping across the entire valley. Looking down from the sky, there were specks of phosphorescence on the ground, forming 3 neat long dragons. The heads of the dragons were passing through the Grimoire's tunnel and entering the Slovenian region. In front of them there was already an endless stretch of lowlands. That was the direction of the capital of the province, Fort Kirkle. However, further away in the hilly region of the east, there was a small group of people standing at the edge of the forest. 1, 2, 3, 4. A group of 14 people was standing beside the horses. A thin young man with a sallow complexion was quietly counting the flames in the valley below. The nearest flame was only the size of a fingernail from this distance. Meanwhile, the ones further away were like the embers and sparks of a bonfire. These flames were scattered across the entire Silverman Valley, like a string of beads in the dark night. The young man's face turned a little gloomy. After he finished counting, he turned around and answered the others, "The white-winged cavalry is probably done for. Owltown, Roden, Milltown, it's all done for. I don't know how many of them survived. I don't think there are many. Thumb and the others just returned from Roden a few days ago. They said that not many escaped. These people are probably all done for. Can you stop talking about it? So irritating." The young man who was still sitting on the horse was not in a good mood. If he had heard that the white-winged cavalry had been completely annihilated, he would have clapped his hands in celebration. But when he saw this scene with his own eyes, he could not bring himself to laugh. Every ball of fire in the darkness was countless lives, and this made him think of his hometown. If it was really like what the Lord said, then perhaps one day the whole of Aween would become like this. He could not help but shudder. Everyone present had the same thought at this moment. They turned to look at the young man in a vest standing at the back. Carglass put down the brass binoculars in his hand and handed it to a young officer from the White Lion Guards. After the battle in Ampere Seal, he and the young men around him were no longer as naive as they were when they were in Tonajul. Their every move had become more mature, or rather, more like a real soldier. He looked at the youths who were dressed like mountain people. Some of them should be the ones who were rescued by Brendel from the Schaflund mines. Brendel had told him that these people were destined to become great figures in the future, but he did not believe it at first. But now it seemed that Brendel's ability to foresee the future was truly extraordinary. After leaving Schaflund, the young man named Cohen led a group of people directly over the Greyhar Mountains. When the Southern Legion left, they attacked the mining area south of the Tosankate forest and dragged out a large number of convicts. Then they headed east into the hills of the Silman region. Although they still could not get rid of the bandits' aura, they had already become the king of the area. The crux of the matter was that the group of convicts selected by the young man were almost all exiles who had offended the nobles, while the truly valiant and unruly ones were not taken in. On the surface, it seemed a little unwise, but if one thought about it carefully, there was another meaning behind it. That young man is not simple at all, Carglass thought to himself. Mr. Carglass, what do we do now? Should we go back first? The young man on the horse asked. Shoo! Carglass put up a finger and gestured for the others to be silent. Is there a situation? Carglass nodded. Quickly hide. The group quickly retreated from the open area at the top of the hill into the forest behind them. About a minute later, a gust of wind blew over their heads. The young men hiding in the bushes stared at the shadows flying over their heads with pale faces. There were 7 of them in total. Carglass was the first to pull his horse up from the ground. The White Lion sergeant beside him shook his head and said, "It's not a skeletal vulture. I've never seen it before." "Is it a skeletal dragon?" The young men chattered among themselves. Carglass pursed his lips and shook his head. It was not a skeletal dragon. Skeletal dragons had the natural aura of fear of high undead creatures. Carglass had seen Alaz in Valhalla and had some influence on the aura of dragons. When those things flew over their heads, he did not feel the slightest bit of fear. Moreover, as bone dragons, those things were a little too small. "Mr. Carglass?" "They seem to be looking for something." Carglass replied, "Let's wait and see." They won't find us so easily in the hills. When the day comes, the undead will withdraw their defenses. It won't be too late to return then. Dozens of skeletal knights were galloping along the mountain path. The metal mail on their warhorses clanged against each other in the night. When the horses' hooves hit the ground heavily, the sound was not as thick and heavy as that of ordinary warhorses. Instead, it sounded hollow as if it came from the depths of hell. As they looked down at the valley below, their soulfire eyes quickly reflected two human cavalrymen who were running for their lives. They had been running for half an hour in this direction, and their warhorses were about to give out. The leader of the skeletal knight pointed his Stygian steel scimitar downwards. The skeletal knights immediately turned around and rushed into the forest. In this area, the trees and shrubs on the hillside were sparse, but there were still skeletal knights who crashed into trees and were smashed into pieces. However, the remaining undead did not even look at their defeated comrades. After passing through the forest that was nearly 100 meters long, they suddenly emerged from the meadow. When Evan turned around, he happened to see this scene. Under the bright moonlight, 11 skeletal knights charged out of the dark and dense forest with green phosphorescence flickering in their eyes. Their bare arms held up their spears and scimitars, reflecting the cold light of the moonlight. He couldn't help but be scared out of his wits. "Chanali, we're dead." "Shut up," Chanali replied in annoyance. However, he knew in his heart that they were going to lose their lives this time. These damn skeletons did not know what endurance was. They would probably continue chasing until dawn. However, there was still a long time before dawn. After such a long time of galloping in the mountains, their warhorses could not last for that long. "Hey kid," he suddenly shouted. "What's wrong?" Ivan replied breathlessly. His face was pale and his forehead was covered in cold sweat. It was as if he was suffering from a serious illness. His horsemanship was only average and was limited to the level of being able to ride a horse. However, under the pressure of survival, he was able to gallop in the mountains. This could not be said to be a miracle. However, the things that happened along the way were enough to scare him out of his wits. If not for his good luck, he would have fallen down the mountain stream or hit a tree and died. "I'll lure them away. You run east. Once you enter the dense forest, abandon your horse and run for your life. Once you're there, you'll be safe," Chanali panted and replied. Ivan's heart thumped. He looked at the back of the old horseman and almost cried. He quickly shook his head and said, "No, we'll go together. I was saved by you. How can I abandon you and run for my life? I can't do it." "If you can't do it, then we'll die together, idiot," Chanali scolded. "Let's die together then. Don't be stupid. We don't have to give them double the battle merits," Chanali scolded loudly. Then he muttered to himself, "All right, although the battle merits might not mean anything to them. Then I'll go lure them away. You saved me once and I saved you once. We're even now," Ivan replied. Chanali glanced at him and couldn't help but laugh. "Don't joke around. With your horsemanship, it's already Mother Marcia's blessing that you're not dead yet. If you try to lure them away, you'll still die together." Ivan's face turned red, but he knew that Chanali was telling the truth. He couldn't say anything. "All right, you still have your fiancée to see, but I have nothing to worry about. I'll drag a few of them down with me. You can live on with me." The old horseman shook his head. "Listen up, recruit. Don't be so shy like a girl. I'm telling you, the lives I owe on the battlefield are more than the meals you've eaten. Now it's my turn to repay my old comrades. Go live on." Ivan stared at him. He knew that the old horseman had made up his mind. He clenched his teeth and forced himself not to cry, but he couldn't make a sound. All he could do was nod. "That's right." Chanali seemed to be talking to himself. He suddenly drew his sword from his waist and shouted. He pulled on the reins and turned around to attack the skeleton knight. The young man seemed to have heard what he shouted. It was for Erwin. But following the sound of the wind, it sounded like a beast's howl. He turned around and urged his warhorse forward, but he saw Chanali's figure getting smaller and smaller. He rushed into the enemy's formation and cut down a skeleton knight with his sword. Then he passed through them. Those simple-minded skeletons were obviously shocked. They quickly turned around and chased after Chanali. Soon the two parties disappeared without a trace. But a few seconds later, he heard a faint shout coming from the woodland on the other side. "Damn skeletons, go to hell. Rosa." Ivan coughed loudly. He could feel a burning sensation in his lungs, but he knew that Chanali did not have much time left for him. The skeletons would soon catch up to him. He raised his head, trying to find the forest that Chanali had told him about. But all he could see was a wide meadow on the mountainside. It was flat. There were some sparse woods in the distance. But it was impossible to avoid the pursuit of Madara's undead. His heart was burning with anxiety as he urged his mount to continue forward. After circling around a large forest, an even more open grassland appeared behind the shrubs. However, at the end of the grassland, at the furthest end of his field of vision, there was a layer of something like a black carpet. It's a forest? Ivan was overjoyed. But then he felt a bitter taste in his mouth. It was too far, at least a few miles away. He didn't know if his horse could last that long. Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses came from behind him. He sensed something and turned around. Indeed, he saw a few skeleton knights appear at the edge of the forest. There were 7 of them in total, and Chanali alone had killed 4 of them. Unfortunately, the remaining ones were not something he could handle. No, I have to survive. Ivan gritted his teeth and said to himself. His life didn't belong to him anymore. He also had his fiancée and Chanali. No matter what, he had to give it his all. He clamped the horse's abdomen and stabbed the spur below the horse's abdomen. He wanted to increase the distance between them. But the monsters behind him were also as fast as ghosts. The distance between them was maintained for a few minutes. The forest was just in front of him. But at that moment, Ivan felt his body become lighter. It was as if a huge force came from behind him. He was thrown into the air and fell heavily on the meadow. He was dizzy from the fall. His body and arms were full of burning abrasions, but his mind was very clear. He understood what had happened. He grabbed the soil and got up. He looked back and saw his warhorse lying on the ground, foaming at the mouth. It was dying. Ivan couldn't help but scream. The forest was less than 100 meters away from him. He didn't expect to fail at the last moment. He tried to stand up and run forward, but he fell to the ground again as soon as he stood up. He rolled on the ground in pain. Then he realized that his leg was broken. It's over. Ivan's heart sank. The horsemen and their skeletal horses were getting closer and closer. But he could only close his eyes and wait for death. But at that moment, a silver light flashed in the forest in front of him. This silver light caused Ivan to be slightly startled. Before he could react, he saw the skeleton knight that was charging at the front suddenly flip over and fall off its horse. On its bald skull, there was a slightly swaying feather arrow stuck in it. The cold light in the forest was just the beginning. Suddenly, dozens of black shadows jumped out of the forest. They were cavalries, but they were definitely not from the White Wing Cavalry Regiment. Because Evan had already seen those cavalries coming closer and closer, their armor was faintly sparkling under the moonlight. The heads of the male lions on the armor were shining brightly. The cavalrymen passed by him. Their hooves fell like rain. The youth was still in a dream. He vaguely remembered that he had heard of such an army before. Soldiers, follow me and destroy these bastards. Karglai's roar echoed throughout the valley. Chapter 856. The silver moonlight shone through the dense foliage and sprinkled on the square, making it look as beautiful as it was during the day. Brendel stood on the balcony of the town hall, overlooking the quiet mountains and forests of the southern border under the night sky. 4 months later, Valhalla had completely formed the embryonic form of a small town. This towering tree was rooted under the mountains in the north of Schafland, and the diameter of its shade was more than 1,000 meters, covering the city below. But now the residents here were only the tree elves, the villagers of the Green Village, and some humans. Most of the humans were members of the Valhalla Wind Archers Guard. Another group of new residents were Kurluts, and the young men of the Folded Sword Squad also lived in the lower city. Valhalla's massive roots divided the city into 4 regions: north, south, east, and west. The Light Elves' newly constructed barracks was located in the western region. Looking down from the plaza, the western region was already beginning to take shape. The streets and buildings were divided neatly. Odom had to admit that as a descendant of the Rune Dwarves, he was quite capable. At the very least, he seemed to be born with a natural talent for city planning. The west region was mainly divided into 2 districts, the north and the south. There was a main street that ran across the entire west region, separating the 2 districts. In fact, this street ran through the city and circled around the lower city of Valhalla. Brando jokingly called it the Ring Highway, but other than him, no one knew what it meant. As time passed, everyone followed suit and called it the Ring Highway. The Ring Highway was also designed by Odom. It was modeled after the 2 rings of Valhalla, and he called it the Third Ring Highway. However, the design of the Ring Highway was not bad. In fact, Brando knew that the old dwarf was discussing with Monique if they could open up the bottom of Valhalla and build a cross-shaped street that would pass through the center of Valhalla's trunk. This way the entire lower city would be connected. Brando naturally understood the benefits of such a design. However, Odom's focus was mainly on defense because it would make it easier for the different districts of Valhalla to defend against each other. Monica didn't object to it. After all, Valhalla was huge and it wasn't a big deal to dig a tunnel from the center. After all, it wasn't a real tree but a magical city in itself. In the north and south districts of the west region, the main building in the north district was a military camp. Other than that, there were also some buildings that resembled human buildings. It was a newly built noble military camp. The noble military camp in the Kingdom of Erwin was no different from the other noble military camps in most human countries. There was a training ground and a camp, which was a functional building. In the game, it could significantly improve the training speed of the soldiers and the morale of the station troops. Brando thought that it might be because of the increased discipline brought by the centralized management of the army. It was just that the game had turned it into data. The White Lion Guards were stationed in this military camp, opposite the Wind Archers camp in the south. There were only 2 functional buildings in this huge city, so it was relatively empty. However, it was much better than the other 3 regions that had not been built yet. Brando was planning to move the entire city of Abes to Valhalla. After all, the city under the giant tree could not be kept a secret forever. In fact, after Odom ordered the workers to build the outer walls, many people had already guessed their lord's plans. However, it was impossible for them to guess that this was the legendary fortress. Brando claimed that this was the giant elven tree that was planted by the tree elves. With his relationship with the druids, no one could find fault with it. After all, there were many such trees in the dark forest, and the druids built their cities on top of them. Perhaps one day, when Valhalla continued to grow, this lie would eventually be exposed. However, Brando believed that by then he would have nothing to hide. At least for now, Valhalla was still very fragile and needed to be protected. In fact, except for a few people around him, most people believed this story, including Veronica, who had been to Valhalla personally. She thought that this was a gift from the druids and did not even think about the legendary fortress. After all, it was a little too ridiculous. Moreover, she had seen it with her own eyes. The fortress had completely disappeared into the loop of trade winds. As for the others, including the young people of the Folded Sword Knight, they were still amazed when Brando brought them to the city. Some of them had heard from the young lady of the Flower Leaf territory about the magnificent druid city of trees, but they did not expect to see it with their own eyes and live here as guests for a period of time. One after another they expressed their interest. The scholar lady had come to him more than once to ask for permission to visit the city. Although Monica did not like these foreign guests, other than not letting Shido into the core area of Valhalla, Brando still gave her the right to visit from the lower area to the uppermost square. His generous move further dispelled everyone's suspicion, including the eldest prince. Today, the young people of the Folded Sword Knight were still temporarily living in the North City district. There were many tents there, but the military barracks and supporting buildings were also being planned for them. In the past 4 months, Monica's clan had increased to nearly 500 people. Now, the entire upper level of the tree canopy could be seen flying between the branches at any time. Under their control, the construction of Valhalla was getting faster day by day. However, the growth of the city itself had slowed down. According to Monica, it would take at least a few years for it to move from this stage to the next stage. One aspect was that the supply of magic could not keep up. Valhalla's demand for magic was a bottomless pit. In fact, almost 2/3 of the ore produced from the crystal mine in the Black Forest had been supplied to this territory, but it was only enough to maintain its daily operations. Tanagel's income from the magic crystal trade had been greatly reduced in recent months. Amandina had warned him about this several times, but the merchant lady was very optimistic about this. In her opinion, the magic crystal trade itself was not a long-term business. The key was that this kind of commodity was too sensitive and could easily attract covetous people. Generally speaking, the high-purity crystals produced by a crystal mine would be quickly consumed in the first few months. What followed was a long and difficult mining, but the output would decrease year by year. The crystal mine found in the Black Forest was extremely rare. If Tanagel continued to export large amounts of these high-purity magic crystals, it would not be difficult for people to guess that a crystal mine with high reserves had been discovered in the territory. Now they could take advantage of the growth of Valhalla to reduce the amount of crystals they sold. As for the decrease in income, in fact, the development of other minerals and specialties in the Black Forest had gradually made up for this. Most importantly, many of the resources in the territory were now self-sufficient. Therefore, the financial dependence on trade had been reduced by a lot. On the other hand, the number of light spirits was also a problem. Monica's 500 clansmen had reduced the time it took for Valhalla to grow from the first stage to the second stage to less than half a year. But if they relied on their own efforts for the next stage, it would take at least 5 years. If he wanted to reduce this time to a year, he would need at least 2,000 to 3,000 light spirits. But the production of light vortices was still only 20 per month. The Moon Tower was currently serving the Mage Tower in the county of Aby's castle, contributing to Tanajal's first batch of wizard apprentices. Not to mention that it was impossible to use it to increase the production of light vortices at this time. Even if it doubled the production of light spirits, it would still take several years to reach that number. The gains did not make up for the losses. The only way now was to first develop the territory and let Valhalla become self-sufficient. Then he would continue to think of other ways to increase the production of mana. There were many ways to increase the production of mana, but it had to be done step by step. Currently the territory only had the Crystal Pool, Mage Tower, Light Vortex and Moon Tower. But Brando knew of a few other advanced buildings that could greatly speed up the construction of the territory. But first he needed blueprints and second he still needed more mana pools. While thinking about these thoughts, Brando took a deep breath and withdrew his gaze from the quiet city below. He turned back and walked back to the hall from the terrace. Valhalla's tree hall was much livelier than it was during the day. Except for Karglais, almost all the officers of the White Lion Guards were gathered here, and against them were more than a dozen sergeants of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Medisha, Hipamera, Amandina, the Shire, and several mercenary commanders stood on the other side. As his old subordinates and confidants, they formed a circle of their own. The remaining smaller circle was the eldest prince and Shido, as well as Lorena and her husband, and the little Prince Haruz. What made Brando a little strange was that the eldest prince did not seem to intend to mix with the young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. But he understood the other party's thoughts after a little thought. The other party did not seem to want to oppose him here. This was a statement. On the one hand as a guest and on the other hand, it was unnecessary because Lenoret knew very well that he, Brando, could not really control these people. These young people from Cruz were rooted in the Empire, and their families, futures and future were all in that homeland. If Erwin was a behemoth like the Empire it might be attractive to some people, but Erwin was just a small kingdom. He did not have to worry about these young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment being truly loyal to him, Count Tanajal. Therefore there was no need for him to fight with these young officers. He was a member of the royal family and must maintain his detached status. His Royal Highness must be very clear-headed and had already figured this out. He understood that if he wanted to control this regiment of knights, he had to give him enough respect because nominally, the Folded Sword Knight Regiment was also loyal to his Royal Highness. Although people with discerning eyes knew what was going on, this layer of skin between nobles was very important, and no one would take the initiative to tear it down. Perhaps even the young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment understood this, but they did not mention it. And it was precisely because of this that he had to act according to the rules. Veronica and Mangrove must have thought so as well, which was why they were relieved to hand these young men over to him. Brando suddenly realized that he had taken things for granted, but he shook his head. This was enough. He did not really intend to take these people into his pocket. He just needed a group of people to help him fight against Madara. The country under the shadow of the East was growing stronger day by day, and the White Lion Knight Regiment that he cultivated could only be considered as an outstanding force in Erewhon. But compared to the next generation of talents that Cruz carefully cultivated, the Folded Sword Knight Regiment, it was still a far cry. The key was that he did not have much time left. He had to arm this army that belonged to Erewhon before the Second War of the Black Rose arrived. Otherwise he would completely lose his claws under the blooming Black Rose. One Freya was not enough. Then what about the Folded Sword Knight Regiment? When he walked into the hall, there was still a heated argument going on. It could be said that it was extraordinarily lively. Both sides were arguing about whether to attack Count Randner or the undead of Madara first. Brando raised his head and looked at the huge map of Erewhon hanging on the wall. There was a red cross on the map where Silverman was located. The White-Winged Knight Regiment had been defeated. It was exactly the same as in history. But this time he had even warned the Grenoir's side, but those rigid noble officers still made the same mistake. In fact, there was a dispute between Duke Grenoir's and the royal faction about whether or not they should warn Duke Grenoir's. That was because Makarov and the others believed that if they followed the original plan of luring the Bloodstaff into the target area, they must not alert the Bloodstaff. But if they did not warn the Grenoir's side, the princess would lose the support of the people, and more importantly, the people of Silverman and Butchie would suffer heavy losses. In the end, the princess personally wrote a letter to the duke to explain the matter. Brando felt that the reasoning of some people in the royal faction was ridiculous. A year later, Madara and Erwin were both on guard against each other. If one side was preparing for war and the other side did not react, then it would alert the blood staff. After all, this was no longer the year of blossoms and summer leaves, but the last season of the Year of Swords. Unfortunately, everything that happened made him very angry. At the same time, he despised the old noble system of the kingdom more and more. The descendants of the ancient nobles were not worthy of their current status. He sighed. There was no doubt that the blood staff would head straight for Viro, just like in history. Even though it was in cahoots with Radner, its goal was different from Radner's. Its goal was to completely occupy Grimoires and Viro, cutting off Karsuk's connection with the rest of Awin. Only with such an achievement could it be justified in the eyes of Madara's supreme ruler and earn it a higher status. The blood staff should know that it had already caused Madara to be wary of it. If it did not take the initiative to attack, then it could only close its eyes and wait for death. However, Count Randner was different. His goal was to rely on Madara to secure a territory that could be defended and attacked. He had completely fallen out with the royal faction, and the best outcome he could hope for was to become independent from Erwin and become a neutral autonomous region between Erwin and Madara. If he did not succeed, then he would at least be able to escape to Madara. That was why his goal was to conquer the Silman and Slovenia regions. However, he had a common goal with the blood staff, and that was Kirkle Castle. Furthermore, Count Randner would attack Kirkle Castle before the blood staff. Before news of his collusion with Madara spread, he would think of a way to trick the gates of Kirkle Castle into opening under the guise of reinforcements. This was the most convenient method. Even if it was exposed, it would be easy to besiege Kirkle Castle. There was no longer any obstacle in front of the blood staff, and the nobles of Kirkle Castle would definitely order the Vermilion Legion to continue south from Brags to stop the undead army. At that time, the rear would be completely empty, and there would be no way to stop Count Randner. However, that was only an if. There were enemies that Count Randner did not expect waiting for him to walk right into their trap. The outcome of this battle was already decided, and the only thing left to do now was to plan how to make them fail. He interrupted his thoughts and came to Maynold's side. Maynold was studying a detailed map on the table. She noticed Brando's arrival and looked up at him, whispering, "You've become stronger after returning from the deadly tundra." Brando was slightly startled. This seemed to be the first time Senior had spoken to him in private after returning from the deadly tundra. He nodded and did not deny it. He had practically shared the experience of the final battle with Milos with Freya. Even though he did not know if the others would benefit from the experience, it was still a huge source of income for him. It was not inferior to the benefits he gained from the loop of trade winds. He had already raised the ranks of the Templar Knight and Mercenary to the peak, and there was basically no need for him to level up these two classes in the future. He had also unlocked the opportunity to become a Frostborn Guard from Sabers, but he had not invested any experience into it yet. This was because there were many branches to choose from for high-grade classes, and Brando was still considering them. Maynold looked at him quietly and asked, "Did you leave Dark Ko-Hua and Kind Ko-Hua behind because of Ekis?" Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized that this was what she really wanted to ask. "Did you feel it?" he asked. "It's different from the game," the female knight replied. "The future of this world." Chapter 857. It was indeed different from the game. In the game, the huge labyrinth in the center of the deadly frost forest remained silent until the Age of Eternal Darkness. Ko-Hua and her sister died in the 7th expedition of the Silver Year players. It was the fantasy wheel that completed this feat, Erwin's most powerful player guild at that time. The Year of the Forest was named after the rapid expansion of the Dark Forest on the border of Fanzan. Madara defeated the Wind Elves and reached her peak in this year. 5 years later, the Battle of the Oblique Forest broke out in the Year of the Horoscope. But in this year, another major event took the players' attention away from the destruction of Erwin's small country. In the Year of the Horoscope, the holy war that lasted on and off for nearly half a century came to an end in the Whitestone Wilderness. In Ansta, the first war slate was unearthed, and then the players discovered the ruins of Agatha. Only 3 months later, the symbol of the Moon of the Harp, Ekis' third daughter, Misha, was killed. Brando suddenly remembered that the Moon of the Harp and Lyra were symbols of fate, and also the source of power for the Witches of Fate. Roman and her aunt once belonged to this branch of witches. He shook his head slightly. In the following year, in the Year of the Bright Moon, the gloomy Moya and the indifferent Atlas were killed. In 7 months, it was Kurlut's most powerful player guild, the Bloodstream Guard, that completed these 2 kills. 5 years later, Mountain King Sherifang was crowned in the Ashen Stronghold. It was the year of the wolves awakened from dusk. In Saint Tassol, the residents of the Cloud Mountains witnessed the wolves devouring the moon. Then 5 dusk wolves descended one after another in Saint Tassol. In the autumn twilight, Song of the Nightingale killed the wise Triest in the wilderness of 4 realms. Eckes' other 4 daughters, Whispering Girl Octavia, the beautiful Tedessa, the arrogant Agatha, and the hypocritical Castrinia were also killed one after another. These achievements were accomplished by the Consecration Guard of Saint Tassol, the Oak Knights and the Dark Princess's private guards, which were the largest player guilds in Saint Tassol. As for the name of the last guild, there was no doubt that Princess Ramona had always been a superstar in Saint Tassol. In the past, there was also a relatively large player guild called the Little Princess's Underwear Collectors Organization. In the end, the Elven royal family couldn't bear it and directly declared it an illegal organization, and dispatched the royal guards to eliminate it. Thinking of these interesting events, Brando couldn't help but smile. This was the story of the Year of Blood. A year later, in the 434th year of the First Era, the Year of the Dragon Shadow, the Golden Palace Ruins Instance Group was discovered. In this instance, the most epic battle in history took place. In 10 months, the top 100 player guilds in Wond were all defeated because their enemy was the most powerful existence among Eckes' 12 daughters, the arrogant Jean Hai. It wasn't until 2 years later that this legend came to an end. In the 436th year, the Year of the Long Night, the arrogant Jean Hai was killed, and so was the taciturn girl Otis. In the 437th year, the Year of the Running Wolf, Eckes' youngest daughter, and also the most popular boss among the players, the Month of the Heretics, the flawless Timmies, was killed. After that, Eckes appeared in the southern border of Erewhon, the White Mountain, the Great Glacier, and Erlanta. The final battle began and the Sage of the Earth, Erlanta, reappeared. After 3 years of hard fighting, the players finally killed the Dusk Wolf in the Alkash Mountains. The next year, in the 440th year of the First Era, eternal darkness descended, and the Second Era began, and the Slate War came to an end. But now, there was a turning point in history at the end of the 376th year of the Sword. Milos disappeared, the labyrinth under the deadly frost forest was completely destroyed, and Ko Hua and her sister survived. More importantly, the news from the north made Brando uneasy. The Lion Men's Toquinen Fortress, the Cruz's border city of Voles, and the Wind Elves' port of Oscan all suffered devastating magic attacks at the same time. Now, all 3 parties were suspecting each other of who was the real culprit. Although the higher-ups were still suspicious, the destruction of the 3 cities intensified the conflict among the lower levels. Now, the forces of the Holy Cathedral of Earth, the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and the Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress were basically sitting on top of a barrel of gunpowder, waiting for a spark to explode. The news revealed made Brando feel heavy pressure, so it could only mean one thing, and that was that the holy war that really began in the Year of the White Griffin in history might be brought forward. And after that, the future of this world would return to chaos, and his advantage of foresight would no longer exist. History finally returned to its original point at this moment, as if all its participants were pulled back to the same starting line. Because of this, Brando felt a deep sense of urgency. The advantages that Erewhon had accumulated over this period of time were far from enough. In fact, this ancient kingdom had no advantages at all, and it only recovered some of its previous disadvantages. But it was still very small and weak. Although it had connections with the dragons and the Bugas, and the situation in the country was much better than that of Erewhon in the game, it was far from enough. A lot of things have happened in the Deadly Tundra, and it is indeed not the same as the history in our memory. But Eckes is still far away from us, and I am more worried about the present. Ko Hua manipulated the will of Milos to attack Voles, Toquinen, and Oscan with the divine judgment. Now the borders of Toquinen, Cruz and Saint Tassol are in turmoil. I don't want to let Ko Hua, especially the dark Ko Hua, leave because I am afraid that she will reveal what happened that day, Brando replied. I'm afraid it's not just that. Do you think that they are the key to the turning point of the future? According to what we said in the game, I still remember some details in the dream. Characters like Ko Hua, according to the dream, are called NPCs. In such a large-scale plot, they must be the key points of the plot. Brando, do you think that you can take advantage of it? Maynard asked in a low voice. After the conversation in the Deadly Tundra, she gradually no longer rejected the memories in the dream. Brando was shocked. He suddenly realized that he might have such a plan. It was purely a subconscious habit in the past, but it was not necessarily for the sake of benefits. It was purely to control the variables within the scope of his control. He faintly felt a sense of insecurity in his heart. This feeling had become more and more obvious since he came to this world. Sometimes he wondered why he returned to the end of the year of the 375 year of the year of blossoms and summer leaves. Was it just to save Erwin? Then what was the prophecy about the dark dragon that followed him like a shadow? He subconsciously glanced at the corner of the hall. The witches were sitting there, whispering. They seemed to have recently learned about the identity of the Roman, and they respected him even more. "You are very uneasy." Maynard replied, "Actually, there's no need for that. Just do what you did before and do your best. I believe you can do it well." Brando turned around and looked at her in surprise. This sentence did not sound like it came from the mouth of a female knight. He almost thought that he heard Allium Japonicum lecturing him. He looked at her in a daze for a moment, only to be glared at by her. Maynard turned back and pretended to be indifferent as she asked, "So, what you are worried about is the situation of the Holy War in the future?" Brando nodded. It was indeed so. He asked, "Who do you think will make the first move?" He pretended to listen to the others arguing about the plan to attack Radnor, but his mind was not on it at all. He had already drifted to the border between Cruz and the Great Plains. Maynard lowered her head and looked at the map on the table. The territory of the Cruz Empire was not on the map, and it was only a topographic map of the Silman region. However, she also seemed to see the undulating mountains in the southwest of Cruz. She whispered, "The Toquinen fortress is very important to the Golden Mane Lion Mane Beastmen. I think they will be the first to make the first move. They will attack the Alstom region just like in history." Brando's mind was filled with Veronica's words. He had been thinking about how trustworthy the Imperial Army's words were, but Maynard's words made him realize that she was also aware of the plans of the Cruz army. After all, she had to stay in Valhalla and meet with Prince Lenoretta and the others. On the other hand, she was the person in charge that the princess left behind. Since he had communicated with the princess, there was no need to hide it from this female knight. The key was that Maynard had a very special place in his heart. Although she was unwilling to admit it, Brando still saw her as his senior. At least half of her soul was like his. And since Maynard knew how crazy the Cruz Empress was now, why did she come to the same conclusion as in history? "Do you know something, senior?" he asked in a low voice. Brando knew that in the game, Maynard and her team had established a relationship with the Erwin nobles early on. Therefore, in this era she was likely to know some inside information earlier than him. And these inside information were exactly what he lacked in this period of history. Just like his judgment of Erwin, a lot of it came from the analysis on the forum, and not his own personal experience. "Don't call me that," Maynard glared at him fiercely. "I'm not too sure. I'm waiting for a news. If that news comes as expected, then the Holy War is imminent, and it will unfold as I said. If not, then it's hard to say. But in any case you have to be prepared for an all-out war." Brando looked at her with a wry smile. "An all-out war doesn't seem to have anything to do with a local lord like me." "I know your intentions," Maynard replied faintly. "All of our intentions are now focused on you alone. Don't beat around the bush with me." Brando withdrew his thoughts. The dispute in the hall seemed to have returned to his ears. In fact, the main dispute now was between the White Lion Guards and the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Rather than discussing the way to attack, it was more of a dispute between Cruz and Erwin, which made him a little disappointed. Fortunately, the Shire, Medisha, and the others did not participate in this childish quarrel. Even the mercenary commanders who followed him first, Reto who came from Menta, appeared to be much calmer. Coden did not say a word. The old swordsman was tasting a tree wine that was a specialty of Valhalla. Even though he was not as sharp as the young ones, he could more or less understand Coden's temperament. In fact, he did have a plan, but he wanted to test the young ones in Tonagel. Unfortunately, the results were a little disappointing. The young lions of the White Lion Legion had the same thoughts as most of the people in Erwin. They believed that the focus of this war was on Count Randner and not Madara. In this regard, even the young officers of the White Lion Legion were more radical than the young ones under him. The young ones from the north paid more attention to Madara, but the natives of Tonagel did not seem to care about the Roman Black Rose at all. But Brando knew that he could not blame them. After all, the only impression they had of the skeletons was the confrontation half a year ago. In fact, this had nothing to do with outstanding ability. It was purely a difference in knowledge. But Brando was still slightly disappointed because compared to them, the young men in Cruz were indeed much better, especially the second son of Lord Loston, Little Pero, and the knight Brund by his side. They were not inferior to Loka and the others. If only the outstanding cadets of the Royal Knight Academy were here. Unfortunately, they still had to go to the north to complete the work of the White Lion Legion. This idea was completely unrealistic. From which direction to attack and how to attack depends on the purpose of the war. Little Perro's voice was not loud. After taking off the bearskin coat, he looked particularly thin and weak, as if a gust of wind could blow him down. Isn't the purpose of this war to eliminate internal strife and restore stability to the south of Erewhon? Someone interrupted him very rudely. So what you're saying is not supporting that we should first attack Randner from behind, attack Magidon first, and cut off the old man's escape route. Little Perro did not seem to mind the rude interruption and calmly replied, "For us, attacking Magidon is indeed cutting off Randner's escape route. But for the Count, I'm afraid that's not necessarily the case. After being ambushed, Randner will either fail and retreat, or win and unite with the Blood Staff. In the end, Magidon will be insignificant to his purpose. What they want to open up is the road to Viro, and even if they fail they will only return to Madara. I want Count to be unlikely to return to Magidon after his failure and fall into his own trap, so the talk of cutting off his escape route is pure nonsense." Little Perro finished speaking, glanced at everyone and said no more. "How do you know that Randner will attack Viro?" Brando could not help but shake his head when he heard this question. These young men under his command still did not pay attention to Madara. In fact, it was not Randner who was going to attack Viro, but Madara's skeleton. That was the inevitable choice of the Blood Staff. After listening for a while he could not help but feel a little bored. The young officers of the White Lion Legion still did not realize who their real enemy was, but he was too lazy to go over the details with them. Reality would tell them everything, and after this battle they would understand who their real opponent was. Little Perro had almost guessed his thoughts. Tanagel's army would pass through Chablis, bypass the Silman area, and directly cut off the Blood Staff's escape route. The Blood Staff knew that there was a rebel army there that hated the nobles of Erewhon. It would certainly not enter the barren hills to cause trouble for the mountain people, but it would not have thought that the king of Silman was actually Brando's old acquaintance. The outcome of this battle was actually destined from the beginning, but how to rewrite the details still needed to be carefully considered. What he was concerned about was the strength of Madara's army in this era. There was good news in the magic letter sent back from Karglis. They rescued a member of the garrison who participated in the battle that night. It was said that Madara's army already had skeleton cavalry and fearsome spirits, which meant that the terrifying dark mercenaries in the Sea of the Dead Moon had already joined the battle. The number of skeleton archers also proved that he was worried about the number of liches. However, there were still some things that were not shown. The garrison could not tell the ratio of skeleton soldiers and skeleton warriors in the entire Madara's army. In fact, this was what Brando was most concerned about. In Madara's skeleton army, the skeletons and zombies summoned by the liches were completely different from the skeleton warriors who had been tempered by magic and could use equipment skillfully. In history, after Tamar joined, Madara invented a psychic circle that could directly summon skeleton warriors from corpses, and during the early stages of the Second War of the Black Rose, they also improved the system to advance skeleton swordsmen. Brando wanted to know how much he had changed history. If history didn't change as expected, then Viro's army would be in trouble. This was because the dark nobles of the Sea of the Dead Moon had joined the battle earlier than in history. But what about Valhalla? Brando thought of his own strength and felt a little relieved. When he went to Ampere Seal to solve the crisis of Erewhon, other than the hundreds of hot-blooded White Lion guards, there were only a few high-end combat forces left. Tanagel's army could be said to be almost non-existent. However, things were different now. While he was in Ampere Seal fighting the demons and Cruz's army, Valhalla's army finally showed its strength under Monique's arrangements. First was the Wind Archers. When he went to Ampere Seal, the Wind Archers only had about 100 tree elves who could really fight, and there were about 300 new recruits. But now the Wind Archers had become an army. They had the strength of 2 brigades of 600 people. One had to know that after the completion of the Wind Archers' camp, the Wind Archers had been completely reborn. They used longbows in long-range combat, and in terms of troop level, they were even stronger than the White Lion Guards led by Freya. Tanagel's new White Lion Guards could barely be considered a Tier 3 troop, and according to Medish's estimation, the Wind Archers were at least Tier 4 long-range troops. What was more frightening was that when they used a pair of scimitars in close combat, their combat strength surpassed that of an iron-ranked army. This army was now placed in front of Erewhon's battlefield, a true elite army. On the other hand, the White Lion Guards had also been greatly strengthened. However, it was not in terms of quality but in terms of quantity. Although Brando could not take over the old White Lion Guards in name, Her Royal Highness still drew out a large number of people from the old White Lion Guards, the Royal Knight Academy, and even the local guards to fill up this guard that was nominally under her own command. In just half a year, the White Lion Guards had been filled up from the original empty shell to the current size of nearly 1,500 people. This was under Brando's restrictions because Brando was very clear that in the future Holy War, the cannon fodder army was not worth mentioning at all. What he wanted to build was an elite army like the White Lion Guards led by the ancient sage Eric, and not the old White Lion Guards in the north of Erewhon. Not to mention he now had the Cruz's Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Although Brando's original intention was to let these young Cruz heroes form a real army for him, that was a long-term plan. At least for now, he only intended to let these Cruz people fight independently. In fact, even so, this was a golden army with hundreds of people. It was no surprise to say that this knight regiment could be said to be a waste of talent in Erewhon. The entire kingdom of Erewhon now had to gather the strength of the entire country to put together an army that could compete with them. With these three armies, Tonajel had the strength to go on an expedition for the first time. And Brando was very clear that the next generation of Valhalla's army plan had already been launched at this time. Even without waiting for this war, Monica could give him an answer sheet. Thinking of this, Brando suddenly felt something and raised his head, just in time to see the little light spirit fly in shakily. She did not care about the other people in the hall at all and flew to his side. Hurriedly and with some surprise she said, "My lord, it's a success." Chapter 858. What Monique was referring to was the completion of the Valyrian Warrior Hall. Before Brando left Valhalla for Ampere Seal, he had instructed Monica to build all the buildings that could be built in Valhalla. Although the main focus was to train the wind archers and complete the second stage of Valhalla, Monica still took the time to complete the construction of the Valyrian Warrior Hall while he was away in the deadly frost forest. Perhaps it wasn't complete because the hall had just been completed. It was just that the light elf girl came to report to him a few days ago. In fact, the reason why Brando chose the wind archers as the focus of the initial construction of Valhalla was because he had ready-made tree elf archers as a source of troops. On the other hand, Valhalla didn't have any information about the Valyrian Warrior Hall. It was unlike the wind elf archer camp and the tree nest, which had a clear description of the types of troops produced, how to train them, the price, and the resources required. However, the description of the Valyrian Warrior Hall only had one sentence. It was a functional building. Brando had only seen this description in auxiliary buildings like the Wizard Tower, the Moon Tower, and the Crystal Pool. These buildings usually had to be built by the players themselves before they could figure out their uses. However, the Valyrian Warrior Hall sounded like a training building similar to Erewhon's Noble Army Camp. The fact that the description was so vague made Brando feel very strange. However, at the time when Tonajel was just being built and was about to face a possible war, Brando didn't dare to test his curiosity on such matters. Thus, he chose to build the Wind Elf Archer Camp, which was more reliable. However, this didn't mean that he wasn't curious about the Valyrian Warrior Hall. In fact, as a player he was dying of curiosity. And today his curiosity could finally be satisfied. When Monica came to report to him, her gaze was clearly a little evasive, which made him feel that something was wrong. The first layer of Valhalla was formed during the first stage of the World Tree's growth. This ring spiraled upwards to the plaza area at the top of the tree. It could fit 3 to 4 carriages side by side like a wooden street. Currently, there weren't many buildings on the ring, and there were only a dozen or so elven archer towers. These archer towers seemed to have grown out of the tree trunk, and their bases were tightly connected to the wooden street. Between the archer towers and the archer towers were connected by long walls of vines. These vines were about the height of a person's chest, similar to a parapet with thorns on one side. In addition, there were many ancient tree-like structures between the archer towers. These ancient tree-like structures had human faces on their trunks. Most of the time, these trees had their eyes closed, and only occasionally would they talk to the patrolling tree elf archers. These were the tree burrows, and their roots were actually the root guards that covered the entire Valhalla. Currently, there were more than 220 tree burrows in Valhalla, and more than 2,000 root guards were enough to guard the entire upper layer. The Valyrian Warrior Hall was located in the middle of these tree burrows, and it looked like an extension of the ring. 2 thick tree branches supported the platform, and the entire building looked extremely majestic. The Grand Hall looked a little like the Vikings' longhouse that Brando saw in his previous life, but it was much more majestic. The interior of the building was spacious and bright, and 12 giant pillars supported the hall's tall dome. In the center of the hall, there were 3 to 4 meter tall giant warriors sparring with each other. They held spears or heavy swords in their hands, and sparks flew everywhere as they fought. Even Brando's arrival didn't attract the attention of these brave warriors. Those were the Cloud Giants. Brando looked at these giants happily, and he was both surprised and curious. Once, the noblest bloodline of the giants came from Milos. But the Frost Giants had long become history, and their descendants, the Cloud Giants and Fire Giants, were displaced like the other Silver Folk after the War of the Holy Saints. In the end, only the descendants of the Black Iron Giants lived north of today's Hammer Mountains, and they were the Hill Giants of the Temple of the Earth. Legend had it that the Fire Giants were both warlike and tyrannical, but the Cloud Giants were a legendary race that was no less glorious than the Silver Elves. They lived in the sacred mountain of Storm's End, and were a tribe that adhered to tradition. In the War of the Dusk, the Cloud Giant King picked up a human baby and raised him. This human baby later became history's most famous hero, the Azure Knight. As for the legendary Cloud Giant tribe that the Azure Knight grew up in, it was a mystery whether here or in the game. In fact, this was the first time that Brando had seen these giants with his own eyes. Their skin was very white, and they were different from the barbaric appearance that people imagined. The Cloud Giants, whether they were warriors or craftsmen, were all wearing exquisite armor or gorgeous clothes. Most of them had sideburns, but the sideburns were very clean, and each of them was like a character from the Greek mythology of the previous world. Their eyes were light blue like gemstones, and their hair was made of gold, shining brightly. The weapons in their hands were etched with beautiful patterns, but they were still so sturdy that they were not afraid of sparks flying when they collided with each other. When Brando, Monica, and Princess Medisha passed through the hall, the Cloud Giants noticed their existence and stopped to look at them. A giant wearing a white robe with golden edges walked out of the crowd. When he saw Brando, he probably recognized his identity and bowed to him. "Honorable Lord, I am Babu, a craftsman from the people of the cloud. It is an honor to be of service to you." The giant replied with a gentle voice, looking gentle and polite. But even so, Brando could still feel the extraordinary aura of the other party. "Hello, it is also my pleasure," he replied. "Are you heroic spirits?" "Is Babu, Lord?" Medisha exclaimed in a low voice. "He is the most outstanding craftsman in the history of the Cloud Giants." Behind him are Gorju, Essard, and the king of the forges, Afterodi. They are all the most outstanding craftsmen of different eras. My God, they are all in Valhalla. Other than Babu, Brando did not know any of these names. But other than Babu, the legend of Gaia using his hand to forge the azure lance was a myth that most people in Wond were familiar with. He was the greatest craftsman in the history of the Cloud Giants, and could even be crowned as the craftsman of God. As for the others, Brando understood from Medisha's tone. They were all at least on the same level as Babu. "There are not many people in the modern world who can recognize us. Little girl, can you tell me your name?" Babu asked. "Medisha, I am a silver elf, Lord Babu." Medisha replied respectfully. Brando had never seen her show such a humble side, even in front of him. "Oh, silver elves, I have heard of you." The giant craftsman showed a look of realization. "I heard that the Myernas found a tribe in the Holy Silver Valley. That should be your people. At that time you began to learn to use the law and break through ignorance. Presumably, many years later, you should have established a glorious civilization by now." The rise and fall of history, one civilization after another rose in the long river, each shining brightly in an era. "Seeing you, I am reminded of the past." Medisha blushed a little and replied embarrassedly, "Lord Babu, the era that belongs to us has passed. Now it is the era of the Lord's civilization." Babu was stunned and then sighed, "So it has been so long. It seems that Elaine's river has flowed for a long time." Brando listened to the conversation between Babu and Medisha, and he was shocked. According to Medisha's description, Babu and the others suddenly appeared at the moment the hall was completed. What kind of existence were they? Naturally, he was well aware of this. Craftsmen, whether it was blacksmiths, tailors, bootmakers or candle makers, they were all classified as a separate profession in the game. Just like scholars and alchemists, they were all part of the Amber Sword's huge life profession system. As craftsmen, they naturally had to learn professional skills. Different professions in the game not only limited the upper level of professional skills, but also provided bonuses for different professional skills. For example, blacksmiths would provide a considerable EXP bonus for forging, smelting, and preparation skills. But even so, in order to train a professional skill to the level of a grandmaster, they would at least need to level up the corresponding life profession to more than level 150. Although the level of life professions was more relaxed than combat professions, it was still a long process, at least 10 years of game time. And only by meeting this requirement could a craftsman be called a grandmaster of the profession. And what level was a divine craftsman? Once a skill's level exceeded level 20, every level after that would be an opportunity that could only be encountered by chance. When a skill reached level 25, it could be said to be a godly skill that was close to the Tao. A divine blacksmith would have to reach the level of a godly skill in all of his professional skills that had bonuses. As far as Brando knew, until the last era of the game, there were 3 divine craftsmen among the players, belonging to the 3 most powerful player organizations of the time. And one of the NPCs was the master craftsman of Madara, Beaumiend. Brando remembered that Beaumiend and Tamar had a master-disciple relationship in alchemy. He didn't know if Madara had discovered him in this era. But throughout the history of the Amber Sword, there was only one person who had been crowned as a divine craftsman, Babu. And now, this legendary figure was right in front of him, and he was accompanied by 7 or 8 other divine craftsmen, who might be serving Valhalla soon. Brando now felt like he had been hit by a flying biscuit. Although he vaguely sensed something from Monica's panicked tone, he didn't expect the surprise to come so suddenly. After all, Monica said, "My lord, you better come and see. Something big has happened. There are a lot of strange people in the Lovalan warrior hall that has just been repaired. They seem to be heroic spirits from somewhere." Brando thought that Valhalla had sent him a few instructors similar to Monica, but he didn't expect it to be Babu. This was Babu. It took him a while to react, and he interrupted, "Lord Babu, are you the owner of this Lovalan warrior hall?" Babu stopped his conversation with Medusa. It was obvious that he was very happy to meet an acquaintance. He turned around and nodded. "I am indeed the owner of this hall. Valulan means brave and fearless in the language of the Titans. This hall is the resting place of the bravest warriors in our mythology. The craftsmen would tailor the best weapons and armor for them. After enjoying a sumptuous banquet, they would pick up these weapons and go to war to kill the enemy." Wait a minute. Brando seemed to have understood something. He finally understood why the Lovalan Warrior Hall was called the Warrior Hall, but there was a description of the building's function. This name was ridiculous. He couldn't help but raise his head and ask, "Lord Babu, you mean this is a blacksmith shop?" Babu nodded again. "You can say that." Brando was not disappointed at all when he heard Babu's answer. In fact, he was very excited. He couldn't help but ask, "You mean you will be staying in Valhalla to forge weapons and armor for the warriors of Valhalla?" "Of course, my lord. Valhalla is the final destination of us heroic spirits, but I never thought that it would be able to see the light of day one day. It is our honor to be able to contribute to this place." Brando took a deep breath when he heard this. He was so happy that he almost jumped up. If this was in the game, he would have done the same. What a joke! This was a divine blacksmith. The divine blacksmith, the most legendary blacksmith in history, and 7 or 8 similar characters. With them as blacksmiths, what would the future of Valhalla be like? Brando could already imagine an army fully armed to the teeth, with even their underwear being fantasy-grade equipment, rampaging across the continent. His mind was filled with thoughts of, "I am already invincible," but after being my lord for a while, especially under Amandina's condemnation, he finally calmed down a lot. He held back his excitement and asked, "Then can I let you forge armor and weapons for my army?" "That is my duty, my lord." "Great," Brando blurted out. "What materials do you want? Just tell me, please help me forge 100 sets of fantasy-grade archer armor and longbows. If you can rush it, that would be even better." In his imagination, this was nothing to Babu and the others. They were all genuine divine blacksmiths, and one of them had even forged a real divine artifact, and not a third-rate divine artifact but the Azure Lance. Getting such a divine blacksmith to forge fantasy-grade weapons and armor was not much more difficult than ordinary blacksmiths to forge white plate armor. As long as there were enough materials and magic crystals, they could create standard fantasy equipment like a game. Brando once saw a divine blacksmith forge fantasy armor with his own eyes. Although it was not standard armor, the high success rate of 87.3% still left him dumbfounded. For fantasy-grade equipment, a failure rate of less than 12% was completely acceptable. "No," Brando shook his head, "it should not be acceptable, it should be a big profit." But unexpectedly, Babu shook his head for such a simple matter. I'm afraid it's not possible." "What?" Brando was stunned. "Is it because there's not enough time?" "No," the divine blacksmith shook his head again, it's because it can't be done. Can't be done? Brando asked in confusion. How is that possible? You are the legendary divine blacksmith? Babu smiled bitterly and shook his head. My lord, that was in the past. Now our power is closely related to the power of Valhalla, and Valhalla is now just a newborn territory, so our ability and experience level are actually still limited to a very low level. Huh. Brando did not expect that he would have to face the cruel reality right after he had a beautiful dream. He suddenly realized that Valhalla was also a part of the Amber Sword's game system. If it was still in the game, it seemed unlikely that a new lord would be able to get a divine blacksmith or something like that, and a group of them at that. It was indeed a bit illogical. If others knew about it, wouldn't it be a mess? He thought for a moment and understood that Valhalla was a territory with great potential, but this potential referred to the potential for future development. One day Babu and the others might indeed return to the level of their peak with the growth of Valhalla, but that was a day after all. After Brando woke up, he completely calmed down. He understood that the so-called one day must be quite a long time ago, especially with the level of consumption of Valhalla. Perhaps one day it would become the world's most legendary fortress, but before that, it must have consumed a legendary number of resources. This design was in line with the consistent style of the Amber Sword game. It was a perfect fit, giving you a tempting pie, but also telling you to take one step at a time. You can't eat a fatty in one go. He was stunned for a long time before he had to accept this depressing reality, and couldn't help but ask a little dejectedly, Then Lord Babu, may I ask what level of ability you have now? About the same as the two masters under you. Babu replied. Brando was startled, and then he saw the two master craftsmen, Tamar and Bosley, among the giants. They were one step ahead of him, and it seemed that they were already here when the light spirits finished this haul. Now they were like fish in water. After all, most of the people here were their peers, and they were also legendary seniors. It was rare that they were limited by Valhalla's power, and now these legendary craftsmen were about the same level as them. Otherwise, with their standards, they would only be able to act like elementary school students in front of these people. However, he didn't expect Babu and the other standards to be so horribly limited. It was polite to say that their standards were low. Tamar might be famous in the future and could be considered a quasi-divine craftsman, but to be honest, he could only be considered a talented alchemist. Bosley was indeed a master craftsman in the past, but after being locked up in Grodin's dungeon for so long, he had already slipped. He was now on the same level as Tamar. He was outstanding in Tonagel and even in the whole of Randner, but in Erewhon he could only be considered a first-rate craftsman and not the best. In the whole of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Fanzan and Saint Tassol, there were innumerable masters like them. Brando originally thought that he had obtained a group of god-level talents, but he didn't expect that it was only a group of first-rate craftsmen. Although their future potential was unknown, the future was too far away. At least for now he was depressed. This was the difference between dreams and reality. P.S. I went to get vaccinated, so I was delayed a bit. Feel free to update more to make up for it. Chapter 859. Brando was depressed for a moment, but he was happy again. He suddenly thought of Bosley and Tamar. Even though they were not the best in Wond, they were still top-notch masters in Erewhon. In the past year, the territory had been armed with the Wind Archers and the White Lion Guards with just the support of the two of them. Now, Trentheim, a small place like this, was already one of the best in the kingdom. This was something that other lords would never have dared to imagine. In the past half a year, the refugees from the War of the Black Rose flooded into Tonagel. Brando began to have a large number of reserve soldiers. If he wanted to, he could raise an army that was not inferior to Count Randner's or Duke Viro's private army. However, Brando came from the future and had personally experienced the epic War of the Slate. He looked down on the so-called armies of the nobles in the north and south. In his eyes, an army below grade 3 could only be called a militia that was responsible for local law and order. It was impossible for them to be used in a war. It was precisely because of this that Trentheim's military had become the main problem to stop the expansion of the army. Only the White Lion Guards could wear the inferior magic armor, and even the lower-grade normal White Lion armor was still limited in production. Even if the Ferber territory worked hard to produce it, they could only produce 100 sets a month. The Wind Archers were even more serious. Because the Wind Archers had to be equipped with Wind Archer chainmail and longbows, the army's expansion was shockingly slow. Amandina and Coden felt that Brando's idea was too naive. It could even be said that he was squandering money. He was purely using money to build an army. However, Amandina thought deeper. she faintly thought that her lord might be concerned about the princess's opinion. After all, an elite army of 1,000 sounded much more reassuring than an army of thousands of nobles. Brando's reputation for squandering quickly spread among his own subordinates. Even Yoda and the other mercenary leaders privately wondered if their lord was too influenced by the Bugas. However, how could a mortal's wealth compare to a wizard's? What if the crystal mines in the Black Forest were to be mined dry? The discussion was so heated that even the copper dragon Redo came to persuade him. Brando could only smile bitterly. Fortunately, he did not dare to tell these people his true intentions. Otherwise they would have been scared to death. In his plan, the core strength of Erwin's future army was the White Lion Infantry, which was also the foundation of Erwin's army. It was equivalent to the largest second-tier local army in the Kingdom of Erwin. As for the Tier 4, 5 and 6 troops, he had to find a way to cultivate them as well. As Erwin's unique elite army, he now had the quasi-Tier 4 wind archers in his hands. If he could persuade the centaurs to join his army, he could get the armor and halberd design of the Silver Crown Guards from Eloranta. With a little training, Erwin would have a real Tier 4 army. The Tier 5 army would be the Elder Guards of the Druids or the Ancient Tree Guardians, but the Druids were too old-fashioned and might not join his chariot. The more reliable consideration was to get ideas from the Nagas. Although the Four-Armed Sirens and the Neptune Guards were weaker than most Tier 5 troops on land, they were still Tier 5 troops after all. The most important thing was that the Nagas had no core conflict of interest with the mainlanders, and the kingdom had a fleet that could be their staunchest ally at sea. The Nagas would not be stingy with renting their troops. Erwin could hire these overseas troops in the name of employment. When he chose to ally with the Grey-Fin Nagas, and after the Battle of Ampere Seal, he insisted that the Empire give him the frigate design in exchange. With the Tier 4 and 5 troops, Erwin's strength should be comparable to the kingdom of the late King of the Empire. At that time, Her Royal Highness could rely on the central military power to suppress the whole country, unify the power of the kingdom, and realize the transformation of local feudalism to centralization. As for the Tier 6 troops, Brando had no clue at the moment. In the history of Erwin, the only troop class above Tier 6 was the Silver Elf Temple Guards, and there were no more than 100 of them. His only hope now was that Valhalla would be strong enough. But once Erwin had a Tier 6 troop class, its strength would not be inferior to Madara. After all, Madara was not only facing Erwin as an enemy, it would not be able to resist the threat of the border with the entire country. Once Erwin had this kind of strength, it would be able to force Madara to expand to other countries, and this ancient kingdom would be restored to its heyday. But this plan was no doubt a fantasy to Amandina and the others. In their eyes, the kingdom of Erwin was just a relatively independent kingdom near Cruz. Its military power had never been weak, but it was not strong either. One had to know that in the Cruz Empire in the north, although the basic troop class of the 4 major armies under the direct control of the central government was the Tier 4 Imperial Guard, in reality, the Tier 3 Imperial Noble Cavalry and the Tier 2 Imperial Pikemen were still the main force of the Empire's military forces. Moreover, these local forces faced the same problem as the kingdom, and that was that the long period of peace had led to a low level of training and a breakdown of discipline. Apart from a small number of border regions, most of the Empire's military forces had more or less such problems. In the evaluation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Imperial Noble Cavalry's combat strength had fallen below the limit several times in the past 2 years, and was on par with the Tier 2 troops of the Empire. Of course, the Empire also had the Tier 5 Pegasus Knight, the Tier 5 Grail Knight, the Tier 6 Sword Crusader, the Tier 6 Holy Oil Knight and the Temple Ascetics. There were even the Royal Griffins, the Royal Astrologer, the Temple Priests, and the Flame Family Knight who had a reputation of being a Tier 10 and above. However, these troops were usually a deterrent force, and their numbers were usually not large. Moreover, in large empires like Fanzan and St. Ol, the high-tier troops were the privilege of the empire, and it was a game between the big countries. If a small country like Erwin had a troop class above Tier 6, it would basically change the current order of the continent. The reason why Erwin was so famous, and why even the Buga people paid attention to this small kingdom, was precisely because they once had the White Lion Infantry and the Temple Guards. But that was just a flash in the pan. Almost 10 centuries had passed, and Won's history had never seen anything like it again. Therefore, whether it was Amandina, Coden, or the mercenaries under Brando, they did not even think about it. They only felt that their lord was a little too idealistic. Elite troops were good, but this was too much. Brando was too lazy to explain it to them. His goal was never the present, and the goal of cleaning the country was not even worth mentioning. The nobles in the north were a great threat, but as Valhalla grew stronger, they were nothing more than chickens and dogs. Whether or not Erwin could build such an army was related to whether or not the kingdom could walk out of its destiny in the future. This was the most important thing. Brando had never forgotten that although Erwin's nobles were the cause of the kingdom's downfall, the real cause of its demise was the dangerous enemy that was rising in the east. He held great power in his hands, and he carried out his plans to expand his army at a leisurely pace. But under the surface he was anxious, and time did not stop for anyone. In fact, there were signs that the development of history did not stop for him, but instead accelerated because of his arrival. Erwin's neighboring countries had begun to stir, but the development of his territories was still slow. Amandina and the others saw this, and secretly reminded him to relax his requirements and expand his army as soon as possible. But how could he not understand? But the problem was, what was the point of recruiting more cannon fodder? They simply did not understand what kind of opponent Erwin was facing now. The whole kingdom was still looking at the coming era of war and chaos with an old-fashioned view. In fact, Madara, Cruz, and even the Wind Elves and Fanzan were rapidly completing their military reforms in this era of upheaval before the arrival of the Great Demonic Tide. The Roman Athos in the Dark was the first, followed by the Fanzan, followed by the direct enemy of Madara, Saint Tassol. Cruz finally completed their reforms under the leadership of Emperor Lenarite, and thus suffered the greatest loss in the war. But he was an empire, and the strong support of the empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire allowed him to fail for a while, but Erwin did not have such a strong strategic depth. Erwin could only learn from Madara. He had to be one step ahead of others in everything, or else he would only end up in death. This war was a precursor, and the real beginning of the Wind and Rain originated from the Second War of the Black Roses 3 years later. But that was something that happened in history, and Brando could not guarantee that the Second War of the Black Roses would not start early in this era. But in this war with the Bloodstaff, he had to do his best to find out how big the gap between the kingdom and Madara of this era was. Of course, it would be best to give Madara a warning so that they would feel that the kingdom was not so weak and easy to bully. Then, those skeletons might think more before choosing to start the Second War of the Black Roses. Every minute was a hope of redemption for Erwin. Therefore he had to be cautious and try his best to increase his strength before the war. Now that a group of master craftsmen like Babu had joined him, it was undoubtedly a boost to his confidence, and he was overjoyed at this unexpected turn of events. Tonajul suddenly had more than 10 master craftsmen of the same level as Bosley and Tamar. What did that mean? It meant that the production of magic equipment would increase exponentially, and this meant that the first step of his plan could finally be on the right track. The White Lion Guards would become the foundation of the central army of the kingdom. Brando thought for a while before he came back to his senses. He seemed to have woken up from a long period of thought and asked, "Lord Babu, can the Valyrian warrior hall be put into operation now?" "As long as there are materials, it can be done at any time," Babu replied. Brando immediately took out a set of White Lion armor from the dimensional space. He pointed at it and asked, "Lord Babu, how long will it take for you to produce 100 sets of armor like this?" Brando took out an unenchanted White Lion armor. Babu glanced at it and shook his head in disdain. "We won't produce armor like this. I think this kind of paper armor has no value at all." Brando couldn't help but curse in his heart. Even though the armor was a little shabby, it was still Bosley's latest double-hinged armor. It had 5 points of defense and it was already one of the best among white plate armors. He didn't expect it to be as weak as paper in Babu's eyes. "What a joke. Why don't you take out some paper armor for me to see?" He cursed in his heart but didn't show it on his face. He took out a set of enchanted armor for sergeants and asked, "What about this one?" "It's barely passable," Babu replied. "I remember that I once made a set of toys for my son. It's about the same as this one." Brando almost vomited blood. He finally understood. Even though these giant craftsmen's experience and skills were limited, they were still very knowledgeable. They were using the standards of their era to evaluate these armors. If that was the case, then according to the standards of the era when the Cloud Giants still existed, the white plate White Lion armor was indeed just paper. Perhaps these giant craftsmen were surprised. They had never seen an armor that wasn't enchanted before. This was simply too much of a scam. Brendel suddenly felt a sense of defeat as if he was being looked down upon by a tycoon. He could not help but say weakly, "Lord Babu, how many of these armors can you make? I urgently need these armors to equip my army." "My lord, please refer to me as a craftsman," Babu replied. Even though he was an arrogant person, he wasn't an idiot who didn't know the ways of the world. When he saw Brando's expression, he could roughly guess what mistake he had made. He hurriedly replied, "My lord, please rest assured. The crafting of these armors is very simple for us. It shouldn't be a problem for us to make 2,000 sets of these armors in a month." Brando was stunned. He looked around the hall, then back at Bubbu. If it wasn't for the fact that Bubbu was too famous, he would have thought that this guy was trying to trick him. There were only 10 craftsmen in this hall. Even if they were divine craftsmen, how could they make 2,000 sets of magic armors in a month? Even if they were of the lowest quality? Even if Bosley and Tamar were to do the work themselves, it would take them at least half a month to complete one set of armor. After all, the production of magic armors in AB's territory wasn't only supported by the two of them. There were also a large number of craftsmen from the refugees in AB's castle. 2,000 sets of armor? There's only 10 of you? He asked dryly. "Oh, that's not it," Bubbu shook his head. "My lord, you've misunderstood. There are many other heroic craftsmen in this hall. We can use our heroic spirits to work in this hall. Even though the scale of this hall is still rather shabby, it shouldn't be a problem to make 2,000 sets of armor in a month." After Bubbu's explanation, Brando finally understood. It turned out that this hall was similar to Monica's Vortex of Light. It could also use heroic spirits to work. However, unlike the Vortex of Light, the Warrior Hall could only have more craftsmen when it expanded. Bubbu and the others were the leaders of these craftsmen. He became excited. 2,000 sets of White Lion armor a month, and they were all enchanted. This meant that the White Lion Legion could finally expand on a large scale. Even though the new recruits might not be as reliable as the old soldiers, as long as they wore these enchanted armors, they would at least have the strength of a rank 2 soldier. Otherwise, how could Cruz's rank 3 cavalry still have the strength of a rank 2 soldier? Wasn't it all because of equipment? The Empire's local troops and the nobles' private armies could afford to equip themselves with magic equipment. Now, Erwin's basic troops could finally be equipped with magic equipment. Even though it would require a large sum of money, it wasn't a problem for Brando for the time being. After all, there were some things that money couldn't buy. As long as he increased the production of wind archers by half, he would be able to form an army of rank 4 wind archers. If he rushed it a little, it wouldn't be impossible to double the number of wind archers before the end of the war. 1,200 rank 4 wind archers. This was the year of sorts. Brando almost drooled, but to avoid ruining his image, he quickly wiped the corners of his mouth, causing Medisha to burst into laughter. But at this moment, a discordant voice sounded in the hall. "My lord, forgive me for being blunt. You are wasting the value of this sacred hall by creating these useless things. It is meaningless." The person who spoke had a rough and high-pitched voice, causing Brendel to look back. It was the divine craftsman named Gorzu that Medisa had mentioned earlier. He had never heard of this person before, but from the other party's disdainful tone, he understood that this guy's reputation among the cloud giants was probably no less than Bubbu's. He quickly asked, "What can I do for you?" Brando was a little depressed. He knew that these divine blacksmiths were using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but what could he do about it? On one hand, he didn't have any high-grade blueprints or materials. On the other hand, according to Bubbu, their experience level was limited by Valhalla. In fact, they were about the same as Bosley and Tamar. According to Brando, the best thing they could do to help Tonajul was to expand the size of the 2 elite troops as soon as possible. As for other things, perhaps they could spend half a year or a few months to create an ancient or even fantasy-grade equipment. But what was the point of that? What he wanted was not someone's battle prowess. Gorza shook his head and said, "My lord, it seems that you still don't understand our true value to you." He paused for a moment and then pointed at Bosley and Tamar. "We haven't returned to this land for a long time. We don't know what happened to Wone during this period, but at least we know that these 2 master blacksmiths are not rare. If you want to recruit 8 or 10 of them, you won't have a problem." "Do you think that this hall's value to you is limited to this?" Brando paused for a moment. He realized that there was a hidden meaning in Gorza's words. He couldn't help but look at Bubbu. The divine blacksmith slowly nodded and said, "My lord, as I said before, this hall is called the Hall of the Warriors of Valhalla. It is the resting place of the warriors of Valhalla. Providing weapons and armor to the warriors is only a subsidiary function of the hall." Brando finally understood. He became excited. "You mean to say that the smithy is only one of the functions of this building? It's also a lair?" "A lair needs the support of a mana pool, my lord." Bubbu shook his head. "What does that mean?" Brando was confused. "Then, my lord, have you heard of the name Valkyrie?" Bubbu asked word by word. Chapter 861. Valkyrie? Brando's heart skipped a beat. The maid of Odin in Norse mythology, how could he not have heard of this name? He had long suspected that since there was Valhalla, there would naturally be Valkyries. It was a pity that Valhalla in the Amber Sword was destroyed in a fire, and the legends about it were buried under the ashes. Whether or not they existed, everything was a mystery. A mystery. Now that Babu mentioned this name, Brando had a feeling that it was indeed the case. At the same time he was somewhat expectant. Master Babu, do you mean that Valhalla's warrior hall can recruit Valkyries? How strong were the Valkyries in the legends? They were the chosen ones of the heroic spirits, riding on Pegasus and patrolling the sky. They were legendary existences and myths. This kind of troop shouldn't be below grade 6, right? But Brando immediately shook his head and rejected his own idea. Valhalla was still a low-level territory. Even if it was the most legendary kind, it was still too ridiculous to be able to recruit a grade 6 troop. In fact, the Wind Archers, as the first type of unit produced by Valhalla, had the strength of a quasi-grade 4, which was already extraordinary. If it exceeded grade 6, it would seriously break the balance in the Amber Sword. This world should still follow the rules of the game. Then grade 5? Although this level was a little too low for the Valkyries, Brando felt that this should be the most likely scenario. Legends were legends after all, not to mention that there were a few more abnormal troop types among grade 5 that were still very powerful, comparable to grade 6 troops. For example, Cruz's Holy Grail Knight. When the Holy Grail Knight joined, they swore an oath and a holy relic. They swore oaths of poverty, not marriage, and upholding justice. Although the knight's life was very poor, they gained great power from it. On the battlefield, they could rely on the power of the holy relic to revive Brother Spring on the spot once. This was the most powerful troop among the known grade 5 troops. Brando thought that the Valkyries might also be a grade 5 troop like this. It wouldn't disrupt the balance too much, and it would also show the strength of this troop type. But all of this was just speculation in his heart. The answer would still have to wait for the Cloud Giant's divine craftsman Babu to reveal it, so he raised his head and looked at Babu. The hall was quiet. Babu turned his head and called out, "Brunhilde, come out." Damn. Brando was shocked when he heard this name. Brunhilde was a famous Valkyrie in Norse mythology and Icelandic epics. There were all kinds of legends about her. Some said that she was Odin's daughter, while others said that her image came from the Visigoth princess Brunhilde of Austrasia. In many games and related works in his world, she was described as the head of the Valkyries. He naturally heard of this famous name, but he didn't expect Babu to call out such a powerful character. He couldn't help but curiously look in that direction. At this moment, the sound of a horse's neigh came from outside the hall. A Pegasus flapped its wings and flew in through the arched window of the hall, landing on the edge of the platform. The Pegasus paced restlessly. Its back was covered in platinum armor. Its wings, mane and hooves were burning with white flames, as if it had just flown out of flames. There was also a female knight riding on its back. The female knight wore a winged helmet that covered her face, but her identity could be vaguely discerned from her posture that she was a woman. This female knight was just like the warhorse she was riding. Her entire body was covered in flames. White flames constantly emerged from the gaps in her heavy armor. After she landed on the platform, she did not dismount from her horse. Instead, she held her head high and pulled the reins made of flames to Brendel's side. She did not say a word as she looked down at her lord from a commanding position. This is the Valkyrie? When Brando first saw Brunhilde, he almost thought that he was looking at Madara's Pale Knight. However, the Pale Knight obviously didn't have such luxurious armor, and their horses didn't have wings. When Brunhilde came to his side, he saw that her weapon was a double-headed sword with a very long handle. The blade was very slender like 2 wings. A pair of platinum wings together with her armor and Pegasus couldn't be more gorgeous. Just as he was about to ask about the other party's combat power, he remembered that he could search for the attributes of the creatures in Valhalla, just like Monica and the others back then. He quickly blinked his eyes and switched to a light green interface. This interface seemed to be floating on a piece of cloth. Brendel could not help but suck in a breath of cold air when he saw Brunhilde's face. Brunhilde level 60 Valkyrie, leader, strength, 1033 constitution, 732 agility, 740 bloodline, 180 will, 100 intelligence, 5 perception, 155 skills, magic resistance, heroic spirit revival, final battle fighting strength value, level 8 level 8 troop class. Brando almost blacked out and fell to the ground. The so-called fighting strength value was actually the rating of the troop class. He originally thought that the Valkyrie would at most be a level 6 troop class. According to the Amber Sword's usual style, even a level 5 troop class wasn't impossible. At most, it would be amazing to give a more powerful and practical skill. But the problem was the cloth. Although he had never heard of the final battle before, the heroic spirit resurrection skill was exactly the same as the Holy Grail Knight's faith in Brother Spring. Furthermore, the heroic spirit resurrection skill was also a magic resistance skill. There were 3 types of magic resistance skills in the Amber Sword: magic defense, magic resistance, and magic immunity. Magic immunity was the most abnormal, completely ignoring everything. The effects of magic were the nemesis of wizards. Magic resistance resisted 75% of the magic damage and the effect duration. Magic defense was the worst, only resisting 50% of the magic damage. Magic resistance itself was a relatively powerful skill. Similar skills were only available to unicorns, dwarven rune guards, and Farnesane spell guards, and according to the rules of the Amber Sword, troops with such powerful skills would generally have their basic attributes greatly reduced. For example, the HP of the unicorn was generally lower than the other level 6 troops, and the attack of the spell guard was also the lowest among the level 7 troops. This was because although the basic attributes of different classes were different when leveling up, they were generally balanced. Those with powerful skills often had weaker basic attributes. For example, Brando's Holy Grail Knight belonged to this class, and mercenaries belonged to the basic class with stronger basic attributes. So in theory the Valkyrie had so many powerful skills. Her basic attributes should be relatively weak among the level 8 troops, but what Brando saw was that not only were Brunhilde's attributes not weak, but they were actually stronger than other level 8 troops. Her attributes were already at the highest stage of elemental activation, just a step away from elemental enlightenment. Not to mention that her physique was slightly lower than his now, her strength was a street ahead of him, and her dexterity was on par with his. Her average attributes were also terrifyingly high, but in terms of basic attributes and strength, Brunhilde was a level higher than him. In other words, other than the unreliable foreign aid of Mephisto and Alaz, Brunhilde was now the second most stable combat force in Valhalla. And the average level 8 troop was just at the beginning of elemental activation. Isn't this cheating? Brando immediately felt that he had encountered the legendary backdoor left by the game designer in the game. A level 2 magic territory could actually recruit level 8 troops, and these so-called level 8 troops' combat power was basically comparable to level 9 troops. If this wasn't a backdoor, then what was? To be honest, Brando certainly liked it when it fell from the sky. But the problem was that he never believed that there was a free lunch in the world. Here he drew a big pie for him, and he didn't know what kind of trap was behind it, especially when the more fragrant the bait, the sharper the trap behind it. He had encountered this kind of thing too many times in the game, so everything in front of him didn't make him feel the slightest bit excited. Instead, it created a strong sense of vigilance. He calmed down and said, "This strength doesn't seem to be a level 8 troop, right?" Babu looked at her lord with some curiosity. "My lord can actually see Brunhilde's strength at a glance." Ahem, Brando realized that he had let it slip in a moment of absent-mindedness. Although Valhalla was connected to his own system, Monique and the others didn't seem to know about his own system. Since Monique, who was in charge of Valhalla, didn't know, Babu had no reason to know. Brando thought about this and hurriedly explained. "I can roughly sense it, this seems to be an ability that Valhalla gave me." Babu shook her head and didn't doubt it. "I see, but my lord misunderstood one thing. Brunhilde is not a level 8 troop, but a level 9 troop." "Tier 9? You mean Valhalla can recruit them now?" Brendel was taken aback. "You mean Valhalla can recruit them now?" Not only did Babu's words not make him feel more understanding, but it also made him feel even more incredulous. Who would believe that a level 2 territory could recruit level 9 troops? Based on what? When Valhalla was burned down by an inexplicable fire, wouldn't it be? Was there some kind of conspiracy behind it? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. There was a principle in the Amber Sword, and that was that the reward was generally proportional to the difficulty of the mission. Of course, there was some element of luck, but luck was generally related to adventure. You might find some unexpected wealth, but it was definitely not in the process of a regular mission. Valhalla was through the loop of trade winds. It was obtained through this quest line, and the story of this quest was epic, and the reward of Valhalla was also more than the price of the ticket price. But Brando felt that everything before this was natural, except for today's. It had even broken the balance of the game. He didn't expect Babu to still shake her head. No, my lord, Valhalla can't recruit level 9 troops now. Even if this is a legendary territory, your request is still too much for it to bear. Then what do you mean Brunhilde is a level 9 troop? Didn't you say it yourself? Brando was stunned. What I mean is, Brunhilde is a level 9 troop, but the other Valkyries are still level 8 troops because Brunhilde is the queen of the Valkyries, the leader of all the Valkyries. Her strength is above the others. In fact, there are 4 other leaders of the Valkyries and they also have the strength of a level 9 troop, but the other Valkyries are only level 8 troops. You've grown stronger, Babu replied. So that's how it is. But it's still a little ridiculous for a Tier 2 territory to summon a Tier 8 army. But isn't it a little ridiculous for a Tier 2 territory to summon a Tier 9 army? But isn't it a little ridiculous to summon a Tier 8 army as well? Babu nodded as if it was a matter of course. Of course. Then? Brando frowned, thinking, you're not saying that and you're not saying that, aren't you contradicting yourself? Babu glanced at him as if realizing that his lord seemed to have misunderstood something, and hurriedly explained, my lord, I'm afraid you've misunderstood. I'm not saying that Brunhilde and her people can be recruited in the Hall of Warriors of Valhalla. Of course, the Hall of Warriors of Valhalla is indeed closely related to these brave warriors. To be precise, this hall is the Hall of Dawn. It's a subsidiary building of the temple. The Temple of Dawn? All of the Valkyries live in the Dawn Temple. That is their palace. The Dawn Temple itself doesn't exist in the modern world, but there is an exit that is connected to the uppermost hall of Valhalla. Legend has it that the Dawn Temple extends to the modern world with a silver staircase. This staircase was forged by the hammers in the hands of the people of the clouds. It is the staircase that connects the Valkyries to the modern world. It's a passage. Babu replied. Brendel finally understood what was going on. In other words, the Temple of Dawn was actually equivalent to a lair, and this lair could recruit the Valkyries' valiant spirit, a powerful level 8 troop. The craftsmen in the Hall of Warriors of Valhalla could forge the entrance of this lair, and this job was no different from the other lair, barracks and functional buildings that Monique and the others cultivated in Valhalla. The craftsmen of the Cloud Dwellers could do it, which meant that they had to rely on these divine craftsmen in front of them. This was the true greatest value that Gorzu had mentioned. This was indeed quite a great value. A level 8 troop, even in the Amber Sword, was something that could only be encountered by chance, not to mention a powerful level 8 creature like the Valkyrie. Once Valhalla had them, it could be said that it would be the strongest fortress in this era. If it could survive for a long time and not be destroyed by natural and man-made disasters like in the game, it would not be impossible for this kingdom to become an empire one day. However, Brando was very calm at this moment. There was no free lunch in this world, and it was best not to daydream about summoning a level 8 creature in a level 2 territory. Babu and the others had given him so many conditions, and it was obvious that they had restricted the premise of the appearance of the Temple of Dawn. Needless to say, it wouldn't take much resources or time to complete in Valhalla. Before he was familiar with it, he probably wouldn't consider meeting these legendary warriors. After thinking about this, he raised his head and asked, then Master Babu, what are the conditions to forge the silver stairs to the Temple of Dawn? Sure enough, Babu's first sentence was, it is a long process. Forging the stairs to heaven requires the lifetime efforts of countless craftsmen. Even if we start now and work day and night, it will take at least 1 to 2,000 years to restore the former glory of the Temple of Dawn. Damn, aren't you tricking me? Game designers, you didn't want this thing to come out at all, did you? Although Brando was mentally prepared, he couldn't help but curse in his heart when he heard this sentence. He suddenly felt like he was wasting time here. However, he thought of another problem. When Monica said that it would take time to cultivate Valhalla, she also said the same thing. In terms of hundreds of years, but with enough light spirits and resources, this time was quickly shortened to half a year. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope in his heart. Valhalla's warrior hall would obviously grow with the growth of Valhalla, and with the increase in craftsmen of the Cloud Dwellers, maybe this time could be dozens of times shorter. What about shortening it? Of course, he didn't expect to see the Valkyrie in half a year. For a rank 8 soldier like this, if he could see it within 10 years, then it would be very significant for Erwin. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but ask, if Valhalla slowly grows, how much time can be shortened? That's hard to say. We are also ignorant of the future, Babu replied, but my lord, if you are anxious to see these brave warriors, we actually have another way. Brando was slightly stunned and asked curiously, what way? As you can see, not all the Valkyries stayed in the Temple of Dawn. In fact, after the Battle of Valhalla, many Valkyries and their souls stayed in the modern world together, like Brunhilde and her subordinates. However, most of these Valkyries were heavily injured in that battle and fell into eternal slumber. Their souls were entrusted to their broken armor and weapons. In them. As long as we can repair these armor and weapons, and my lord can find their war horses, we can reawaken these slumbering Valkyries. Babu replied. Brando took a deep breath. What materials do I need to repair their armor and weapons? How long will it take? Where should I find their war horses? He couldn't help but feel a little excited when he said this. If it was before, it felt like a pie had fallen from the sky, but now, it was a true quest-type equivalent exchange. Brando knew very well that to awaken these Valkyries would probably cost him a lot. He had to pay a huge price, but it was definitely worth it. Because every time he awakened a Valkyrie, Valhalla would have a top combat power that was at least at elemental awakening or even close to elemental activation. Babu paused for a moment, then said, My lord needs to prepare the gold of the river, the sharp teeth that cut off the future, the blood of the Hydra lizard and the singing silver. As for the Valkyrie's Pegasus, Monica spoke on behalf of him, we must build a nest for the wind steed. Holy shit. Brendel's head fell to the ground when he heard the request. P.S. This is the last chapter of the month. Everyone can see how I've been updating this month. I haven't stopped updating for a single day, and I'm full of integrity on the weekends. I'm here to ask for next month's monthly votes, and I promise that I'll continue to maintain my current integrity next month. I hope everyone can wait and see. I'll consider doing a double update at the beginning of the month tomorrow. I'll do it on Monday next week. I hope everyone will continue to support me. Chapter 863. The gold in the river wasn't referring to the gold that was buried under the sand at the bottom of the river. Instead, it was referring to the gold that was rich in magic that flowed quietly beside Elaine. This was one of the most precious treasures in the world. Witches often used it as a medium to change the future of witchcraft. That was why it was also known as the witch's gold. In the countryside, the greed that was often mentioned in fairy tales. The gold that the witches worked tirelessly to collect was actually referring to the same thing. This was an extremely rare magic mineral. Just a tiny bit the size of a fingernail was worth as much as a castle. In the game, the witch's gold had another important use, which was to break the strings of fate. Simply put, this kind of gold was necessary to go from the highest stage of the elemental activation realm, the sage realm, to the realm of perfect body. It was necessary to use it as a medium to cast extraordinary spells. Before the War of the Slate Slabs, Brendel had never even heard of this legendary mineral. It was only occasionally mentioned in some books. The first time the players of Wone discovered the witch's gold was after the end of the Holy War. In the Year of Sparks, the first slate was found in the White Mountain at the border of Saint Tassel. Since then, the players began to enter the Black Forest on a large scale. This was the first time the witch's gold appeared in the player's vision. But this kind of gold was extremely rare even in the Black Forest. To put it simply, the probability of it appearing was slightly lower than the Spring of Youth. And every time a Valkyrie was resurrected, it would require a pound of the gold of the river. A full pound. Brando even had the thought of killing Babu. It would be better to just tell him that the Valkyrie could not be resurrected. In comparison, the other materials were much simpler. Cutting the future teeth was referring to Fenrir's teeth. Of course, its children were also counted. Fenrir's children were considered twilight monsters, which meant that they would only appear in the Calamity of Wolves, and it had to be a large-scale one, such as the one in the Loop of Trade Winds. And often, the appearance of Fenrir's children in the Calamity of Wolves meant the complete destruction of an area, accompanied by disaster and slaughter. Their teeth were rarely left as spoils of war. It was equivalent to being worth thousands of gold. As for the blood of the Hydra lizard, it was the best thing for him to obtain because he had the eggs of the Hydra lizard. As long as he could cultivate the Hydra lizard nest, he would naturally have as much Hydra lizard blood as he wanted. As for the singing silver, this thing only appeared in the Black Forest singing spring. Its rarity was second only to the river's gold. Fortunately, there were very few people in this world who knew how to use this magic metal. Most people treated it as a collector's item, so its price in the market was not high. Occasionally, it would even appear in auctions around Ampere Seal. Everyone could see that as long as one paid attention and was willing to spend a lot of money, it wasn't impossible to collect a silver that could sing. The Wind Steed's Lair. That's right. The Riding Wind Colt was a level 6 creature and it was one of the more precious ones. It was only occasionally caught in the wind elemental plane. As for its nest, no one had ever seen it before. He had never even seen a nest before, so how could he build it? A nest for this thing? Unless Valhalla itself could provide the lair of this thing, it was basically wishful thinking. However, he had repeatedly asked Monica, but she still did not know anything. The light spirit girl still said the same thing. The knowledge she knew was limited by Valhalla. When the Valhalla Warrior Hall was built, information about the Valkyrie entered her mind. But as for she did not know anything else. However, she gave Brando a compromise, and that was to buy a riding wind colt. The market price for one was only 1.2 million tor, which was the income of the Tonagel for half a year. When Brando heard this, he wanted to shut the light spirit in the drawer, so that she would not continue to nag in his ear. He could not help but sigh deeply. Sure enough, there was no free lunch in the world. Whether it was forging the silver staircase or awakening the dormant Valkyrie, at least for now, they were all things that were out of his reach. Fortunately, when the Valhalla Warrior Hall was built, there were a few more famous Valkyries, such as Brunhilde and her 4 deputies, Skagall, Courtney, and Grey. Skagall, and Grey were all famous Valkyries in history. Other than Brunhilde, who was at the peak of elemental activation, the others were also at the peak of quasi-level 9. In terms of strength alone, they were more powerful than Brando himself. However, their combat strength was far inferior. Brando had fought with each of them in private, and he had to use 9 luminary sword art and flash strike sword art to defeat Brunhilde, who was the strongest in combat. As for the others, he could easily defeat them with just his terrifying combat experience. He even estimated that if the Planeswalker's abilities were more mature, and coupled with the Planeswalker's abilities, even if these 5 Valkyries were to fight against him, he would still be able to defeat them. If the Valkyries worked together, he would still have the strength to fight. However, Brando did not think about this. His trial battle had won him a lot of respect among the Valkyries. The Valhalla Warrior Hall's heroic spirits respected the strong, and his strength as their leader had obviously won the unanimous approval of Brunhilde and the others. Even Babu's attitude towards him had become more respectful. Unfortunately, this kind of respect did not mean anything. Babu actually told him that Brunhilde and the others could not leave Valhalla to fight because Valhalla could not afford their mana consumption. When Brando heard this, he almost fainted. It turned out that before the Dawn Sanctum was built, the Valkyries' daily activities all came from the mana reserves in Valhalla. If they patrolled and fought in Valhalla's area, then the consumption was still very low. According to Babu, there were only a few hundred to 1,000 units of mana per day, which was the mana of 10 moon crystals. However, once they left Valhalla's area, the consumption would increase exponentially. Brunhilde and the others would need to leave Valhalla for a week, and they would need to use up as much mana as Valhalla's first phase. The total amount of mana was a little more than 130,000, which made Brando's teeth ache a little. For example, the war with the Bloodstaff this time could be considered a small-scale civil war and border conflict, but it would drag on for at least a month. In a month, he would need to pay a few thousand moon crystals. Although it was not that he could not afford it, it was obviously not worth it. Moreover, if the war dragged on, the money would flow out like water. Therefore, Brando decisively let Brunhilde and the others stay. The reason why Hilda and the others stayed in Valhalla was because they were not needed in this war, and their claws were sharpest when they were hidden. On the other hand, Brendel understood that these Valkyries were mercenaries to Valhalla. Not only did they have many restrictions, they were also extremely valuable. In short, if he could not use them, then he would not use them. He sighed and could only think so. He raised his head and it was drizzling in the sky. After the moon of autumn, the weather had turned cold. The rain brought with it a bleak chill, and when it touched the skin, the chill seeped into the bones. The Chablis region was filled with rolling hills. In such a cold and humid weather, he stood at the top of a hill and looked down. In his field of vision, there seemed to be countless figures moving through the forest at the foot of the hill. Under the jagged leaves of the Erewhon oak, or under the fine leaves of the blue oak, there were many figures in gray cloaks moving forward. Not all of them hated the rain. Some of them took off their hoods, revealing their beautiful faces. Their long blonde or green hair stuck to their slender necks and smooth foreheads. Beside them was a pair of pointy ears, and they carried a wind archer bow that was one size bigger than the elven longbow. One after another, they passed through the dense thorny bushes and wild strawberry bushes. It was already the 3rd day since they left Valhalla. In these 3 days, the news on the battlefield in the Silman region was constantly passed to Kargleis through Cohen's spies, and then to him. He then categorized the information and selectively revealed a portion of it to the princess. The reason he did this was because he knew that most of the military intelligence was to be provided to Viro. Compared to the lords and generals of Lantan Island, there was no guarantee that there were no spies or spies among them. He did not want to expose his relationship with the King of Silman to avoid attracting the attention of Count Randner and the Blood Staff. Of course, the princess already knew about the existence of these Silman's bandits from the private messages he exchanged with her. It could be seen that she did not trust Cohen and the others very much. This was determined by her position. She was born in the royal family, and naturally represented the interests of the nobles. She would not have a sense of approval for a mob like Cohen who wantonly attacked the nobles' territories. In fact, Her Royal Highness had advised him more than once not to try to recruit these people because it would be extremely dangerous. It would cause great damage to his reputation among the nobles. However, Brando often did not know whether to laugh or cry at such petty advice from the princess. He naturally knew what kind of person Cohen was in history. How could he give up the opportunity to befriend such people for the sake of those pedantic nobles? Cohen was the king of Count Randner in history. He overthrew Count Randner from scratch. In the chaotic balance of power in the era of Erwin, he obtained the recognition of all parties with his strength and became an independent king. Even before the Battle of the Oblique Forest, even Madara recognized his position. For a long time he existed as a buffer between Madara and Erwin. After the fall of Erwin, he assisted Ella in the battle against Madara. However, at that time, Erwin's players had already fallen apart. He did not know what happened after that. However, such a person would definitely not be a simple bandit or a bandit. The battle at the front line was very stalemate. After the Blood Staff defeated the White-Winged Knight Regiment in the Silman Valley, the deputy commander, Walter, had been confirmed to have died on the battlefield that night. This bad news was equivalent to announcing that the White-Winged Knight Regiment had been annihilated. It meant that the entire Grimoire's passage was now exposed to the thorns exposed by the blooming black rose of Madara. The Vermeer Legion had to be divided. The soldiers entered the northern part of the Tosankared forest to defend, but the results were minimal. After a few defeats, the remaining human troops had been forced to the southernmost part of the Manowir region. According to the news from the front line, the undead army had already passed Silafarn and was about to conquer the most prosperous area of Grimoires. Although that place was now in a state of panic as if it was the end of the world. The Grand Duke of Grimoires was sending people to the north to seek help from Karsuk, but in the eyes of outsiders, the nearest army was still in Lantan Island, which was the private army of Grand Duke Cananon. Not to mention the army of Viro and Karsuk, it was basically like distant water could not quench a nearby fire. Now, whether it was the Blood Staff or the others who were watching the war, there was no exception. Madara would definitely win this time. Even in Ampere Seal, some of the crew's envoys and the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire who had not yet evacuated were watching coldly. They could not help but gloat in their hearts. Erwin's people were making the same mistake again and again, which was undoubtedly very stupid in their eyes. But in fact, only a few people who were planning this war understood that an army had sneaked under the nose of the Blood Staff, and a real war was about to begin. Brando lowered his head to look at the Wind Archers, then turned his head to look at Quinn who was standing silently beside Medisha and Fanny. The tree elf leader had rushed over from the loop of trade winds day and night after hearing about his war plans. He stood in the rain and folded the letter in his hand, which was made from dried leaves of a huge oak tree. He smiled and said, "Thank you for bringing me a little Quinn. Help me tell Sifred that we haven't forgotten about her. Once she becomes a true priestess of the forest goddess, we'll welcome her back to help Trentheim." Quinn glanced at Brendel. "My lord. Just call me Mr. Brendel, it's more pleasing to the ears." Brendel waved his hand. "My lord, please call me Mr. Brendel." Quinn frowned. "Mr. Brando, the elders hope that you will keep your promise. We rarely come into contact with humans and the rumors about you. I naturally understand that there are some unscrupulous merchants and even nobles who have tarnished our reputation. But I'm different. The changes in the loop of trade winds are obvious to all." Brendel replied, "The Grand Elder and the others should understand that humans have two natures, greed and curiosity. It is precisely because of these two natures that they have an endless drive to explore the unknown world. I'm just giving them an opportunity. It's just an opportunity, but only I know how to do it. The development of the Dark Forest can't take any setbacks, but once the humans have tasted the benefits, our achievements today will no longer be based on a single era. It will bring a tradition to all civilized countries, to open up the wilderness. That will be a brand new era, and civilization will no longer be like today, cowering in a corner." Quinn nodded. It was precisely because of Brando's words that the elders were convinced. Otherwise, even if the youth had ignited the fire seed of the loop of trade winds, the druids who had always been neutral would never step into the human world's strife. But now, Brando's ability proved that he was the only one who had the ability and courage to open up the borders of darkness. The druids must stand with him and support him in controlling this ancient kingdom. Brando painted a tempting picture for them, and once the scene in the picture scroll was realized, it would be the dream of the druids for generations to come. It was so grand and magnificent that Quinn could not understand why a superficial human noble, would have such ambitions. He looked at Brando and replied, "I'll pass on your words to the elders. I'll leave my children in your care. Please treat them well." Brando nodded solemnly. He was not keen on war, but Erwin had to live. Sometimes people had to fight to live. Count. At this time little Pero, who had been standing aside, finally spoke. Veronica had asked them to stay in Valhalla to protect His Highness Leneret. The young men of the Folded Sword Knights had inherited the best qualities of the Imperial Army, loyalty and obedience. There was no objection at all. However, they were a little embarrassed at the moment. The Folded Sword Knights could not exist as an independent armed force in Tanajul. Little Pero and Brun knew this in their hearts, so nominally they were under Brando's control, but as for how to control them, it was very particular. If His Highness Leneret was only here for a general stay, then they should exist as the private guards of Cruz's eldest son. In this case, Brando could limit their scope of activities and power, but could not directly order them. Another situation was that His Highness Leneret was here to ask for protection. In this case, in addition to the personal guards, Emperor Cruz's eldest son obviously could not have a private armed force, but Veronica did not make it clear to them on this matter. The current situation seemed to be that His Highness the eldest son was seeking protection, but the Lord of Tanajul did not directly order them to disband on the spot and return to the Empire, which seemed a little subtle. A few days ago they accompanied the eldest son to participate in the military meeting at Brando's invitation, and the message revealed in it was very memorable. The Lord of the Legion did not explicitly tell them what to do here. It could be said that he neither agreed nor stopped them, but the Lord obviously intended for them to participate in this war, or at least showed them one thing: an attitude. As for what the Folded Sword Knights would choose, little Pero was actually very clear. The warlike blood flowing in their bones had helped them make a choice, and they certainly wanted to participate in this war. Chapter 864. They had thought that if they stayed in Erwin, there was no doubt that their next life would be boring, even monotonous. This was not the Empire, there was no opportunity to make a name for themselves. There were no enemies like the Hazel people, the Wind Elves, the Fanzan Knight, or even the Barbarians. Their role here was only to fulfill their duties. They were soldiers and naturally had to obey orders, but at the same time, they were still young, hot-blooded knight, who did not want to conquer the battlefield and make meritorious contributions. But suddenly such an opportunity appeared in front of them. Although they were not fighting for the Empire, at least they were not enemies of the Empire. The nobles of Erwin were also recognized by the various countries. The key was that if the Crown Prince also recognized them, then they were in fact equivalent to fighting for the Kurlutz royal family. Almost everyone was tempted. Little Pero even asked Veronica and the Crown Prince's opinion at the instigation of Brund and the others. The answer he received was that Prince Leneret was secretly staying in Erwin as the most distinguished guest, sharing honor and disgrace with Count Tanajul. Therefore, Tanajul's war was His Highness Leneret's war. So, if Count Tanajul allowed it, the Folded Sword Knight Regiment could be allowed to take orders from Erwin at the same time, but they still had to prioritize the safety of His Highness the Crown Prince. This answer revealed too much information. But little Pero was not in the mood to analyze how many conspiracies and interest exchanges there were, because he was also tempted. They were born for war, who would not be willing to go to war to kill the enemy. In addition to the confrontation with their own country, they can fight with all the enemies. War is their glory, scars are their medals they have won. They were called the Imperial Knight Regiment. 3 days ago, Brando still brought all the members of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment in the name of the observation group, and even Prince Leneret was in this so-called observation group. But little Pero understood that their opportunity had come. Seeing that they were getting closer to the battlefield day by day, he finally could not help but call out to the Count. Brando glanced at him and smiled in his heart, thinking that these guys couldn't hold back anymore. When he made Veronica agree to let the Folded Sword Knight Regiment stay in Erwin, they were loyal to the eldest prince and at the same time obeyed his orders, but he played a trick and did not let Veronica directly tell the inside story to these young people. The reason was simple: he knew that with a little, if he gave these young people a hint, they would definitely not be able to resist it. He knew these young war maniacs from Cruz too well. In the future, 1/3 of the Empire's generals would gather here. These people were born for war and could not bear the loneliness. These young knights have received the strictest training. They have gone through the most rigorous knight examination and combat test. It was impossible for them to come to Erewhon for a vacation. If there was no chance, they might be loyal to their duty and be willing to be lonely. But if there was a slight possibility, they would definitely seize the opportunity. Therefore, instead of giving them orders, it was better to take the initiative to stimulate their enthusiasm. He also wanted to see how powerful these future generals of the Empire were. But even if he had such a plan in his heart, he still asked faintly, "What is it?" The rolling hills of the Slovenian area extended to the end of the Pine Mountains in the Silman area, and the eastern foot of the Chablis Mountains converged here, outlining the most rugged terrain in the northernmost section of the Grimoires Passage. This was also the easternmost part of the Tosankade forest. In history, Iko and his fiancée Yura led the coalition forces of Lantanailan and Viro to ambush and defeat them here. Today, as if history was repeating itself, the undead army that covered the mountains and plains once again entered this area. The sky was gloomy, and the entire mountain seemed to be emitting a chill. However, for the undead, cold and heat didn't matter. The skeletons advanced along the valley, making cracking sounds. The forest seemed to be filled with gray skulls. There were also some skeleton knights in the distance. Unlike human knights, these skeletons rarely carried banners. Their pitch-black spears were their weapons. Flags. The development of the war was somewhat unbelievable. This was especially so for the Bloodstaff. Ever since the White-Winged Cavalry was completely annihilated in the Silman Valley, the Erewhon army on the other side had been completely passive. The Vermeer army was forced to change their defense on a large scale, which caused the morale of the entire battle line to be low and exhausted. This brought about serious consequences. In the battle a few days ago, the undead army had almost defeated every army that stood in their way. The enemy, the Vermeer army, was completely defeated. It was even worse than the defeat in the First War of the Black Rose. It was as if the Bloodstaff suddenly found that there were no more enemies in front of it. The closest army of Erewhon was still far away in Lantanailan. Even if they started moving now, it would take at least a week for them to reach Kirkle. Kirkle would be in ruins. And there was still no sign of Karsuk and Viro's army. Once it took down Kirkle and joined forces with the human Randner, Lantanailan's army would not be worth mentioning. This was something that the Supreme One could not do in the war a year ago, but now it was easily done for him. The Bloodstaff's heart was filled with pride and satisfaction. In his opinion, the Erewhon army of Grimoires was not worth mentioning. He had once swept through Karsuk, and those Highland knights were his real opponents. In comparison, the Erewhon people of Grimoires were weak and stupid. It was a disgrace to suffer losses in the hands of such an enemy. It seemed that the one-eyed dragon Tago was only SOSO. He had heard that the army that invaded Buchi had encountered some trouble. The Supreme One with the Mercury Staff in Madara was only able to ascend to the throne because of those self-righteous vampires. Now it seemed that her vision was only SOSO. In the Bloodstaff's heart, it seemed that even the reverence for the Supreme One had decreased by 30%. Pale phosphorescence burned in its eyes. Its cold gaze swept across the undulating hills where its undead army was rapidly expanding. If it was a little stronger, then even in Madara the Supreme One would not dare to act rashly against it. But the only thing that bothered it was the dark mercenaries from the Sea of the Dead Moon. Their greed was a little excessive. Beyond its expectations, the beggars originally only wanted some land rich in magic, but after witnessing the weakness of humans, they began to have ideas about the big cities in his hands. But how could it just hand it over? Those were countless skeletons and souls. But the Bloodstaff did not know. While it was calculating the gains and losses in its heart, the dark mercenaries in the army who had been fighting for a long time and almost treated fighting as a natural activity like eating and sleeping began to feel that something was wrong. Generally speaking, when the scouts on the periphery of the army were limited, an inexperienced commander might only feel it after a while. His ability was limited. But for a veteran, as long as they lost a team of scouts, the vigilance accumulated from countless life and death experiences would make them feel uncomfortable as if their necks were being strangled. At this moment, the Dark Lords from the Sea of the Dead Moon had such a feeling. In the past hour they had lost more than 5 teams of scouts. The entire northern side of the army suddenly seemed to be shrouded in a layer of fog. These Dark Lords instinctively felt the danger. While they were aware of the situation to the Bloodstaff, they also sent more skeleton cavalry in that direction. The Bloodstaff was also an old rival of the Erewhon, but the conclusion he came to was very simple. The Erewhon people were ready to stake everything. They wanted to stop the undead army from blocking the undead army. Otherwise, if they missed this barrier, the Kirkle Castle would be defenseless. This conclusion was approved by the Dark Lords. After all, unlike the Bloodstaff, these dark nobles from the Sea of the Dead Moon knew nothing about the Erewhon. Other than the Vermeer Legion in front of them, the only thing they knew about the kingdom was the White Lion Legion and Ampere Seal. It could be said that their current military deployment of Erewhon in the south all came from the Bloodstaff. The Bloodstaff told them that there was no one left in Grimoires. They believed the existence of such an army and did not consider the existence of other ambushes. In fact, the Bloodstaff's judgment could be said to be correct. According to the information from Madara, the south of Erewhon was now a sheet of loose sand. Princess Griffine had unified the forces from Ampere Seal, Arek and Tonajal, but she only had nominal power to rally Lantanilan, Viro, Grimoires and Karsuk. Moreover, the lords of these areas had their own conflicts. Before facing a real threat, the possibility of forming an alliance was very slim. However, the Bloodstaff would never have dreamed that in the south of Erewhon, there was a knight madman called Iko. The thing he loved to do the most in life was to poke his nose into other people's business. In history, this Lich Lord had carelessly lost his life in such a reckless manner. At this moment he was still stubbornly stubborn, repeating the same mistake. Moreover, this time, not only did the madman knight Iko intend to teach him an unforgettable lesson far away in Tonajal, there was also a sinister and cunning existence that had been scheming against him since a few months ago. Iko was frowning as he stared at the map in front of him. At this moment he was not only the representative of Lantanilan, but also the commander of Duke Karnan's noble army. Of course he did not have any commanding skills. In fact, the entire battle plan was completed under the repeated modifications of Buga, Makarov, Audin, Yura, and the knight generals under Duke Viro. Of course, the Highland Knights had also been included. In the end, the Highland Knights side sent a small group of Silver Knights. There were about 400 of them. Although the number was not high, their average strength was enough to raise eyebrows. Not to mention, this group of knights was accompanied by a group of wizards of the same strength. Such a luxurious arrangement almost made everyone feel a little surprised. It had to be said that the Highland Knight had always maintained a transcendent position in Erewhon, relying on their strength that was superior to the kingdom. However, after the princess told Brando about this matter, Brando was a little amused. He knew that the Highland Knights side did not have many knight groups like this. There were only 3 of them and they were their elite troops. This time they should be the Knights of the Sacred Stone. However, it was a little strange for them to make such a statement. It did not seem to be necessary to say that they were showing off. Their current status was not something that could be achieved in a day, and their current actions seemed a little too enthusiastic no matter how one looked at it. However, in fact, since the Battle of Ampere Seal, the behavior of these knights was a little too strange. They could have not gotten involved in that muddy water at the beginning, and it would not have done them any good. If they had joined the battle just because of his grandfather's identity, Brando felt that it was a little too unreasonable. However, he could not guess the thoughts of the Highland Knight at the moment, so he did not mention anything about it in the letter. What he was concerned about was another matter. The entire battle plan was in fact written by him. It was not easy for him to persuade everyone to focus on the Bloodstaff through the princess. It had to be said that the people of Erewhon in this era seemed to have a deep-rooted prejudice against Madara. They thought that the country in the darkness was only good at small skirmishes at the borders. After the War of the Black Roses, most people thought the same way. In fact, during the war a year ago, the undead army didn't enter Awin's borders, and the flames of war only stopped at the borders. Only the Vermilion Legion, the Southern Legion, and the Highland Knights fought against Madara. Thus, in the eyes of most people, the undead army didn't even reach the borders. In the eyes of most people, including those who had fought against them, Madara was an image that could be compared to bandits and robbers. Whether it was the royal faction or Duke Viro, most people's attention was on Count Randner. In their opinion, what they should do was to first defeat Count Randner, and then the Bloodstaff would naturally retreat after losing its spy. Even the Highland Knight had the same opinion. They had fought against Madara the most and had the deepest prejudice against them. Karsuk, but it was actually an exaggeration. At that time, the Bloodstaff's vanguard did not even sweep half of the Karej region before it was stopped by the Highland Knight west of Silverhorse City. After that, it went south to Gold City and circled around before returning to Madara. They knew best how capable those skeletons were. On the other hand, Count Randner was Erewhon's greatest threat. Once Count Randner was defeated, the chaos in the south would basically be half resolved. As for Duke Vero, he still had a personal grudge against Count Randner. The only one who supported Brando was Eek, but the Night Madman simply did not want to fight in a civil war. In his opinion, the invaders should be taught a lesson first. But in the end, Brando convinced everyone with the reason that Count Randner could escape to Madara even if he was defeated. Although it did not matter to Erwin whether Count Randner escaped or not, this reason convinced Duke Vero. This duke was definitely the one who was most unwilling to see Count Randner escape. The hatred between the Duke and Count Randner went back several generations, and it could be said that it would not end until one of them was dead. Duke Vero. Since he supported Brando's plan and Lantern Island's representative Eek, the Highland Knight no longer objected. In the end, Brando's plan was unanimously approved. The priority was to ambush the Blood Staff. This battle plan was basically copied from the time when Eek and Yura led the Allied army to ambush the Blood Staff. The location of the ambush was still in Silafarn, which was the most advantageous terrain. It could be said that they had a greater advantage now compared to the past. In the past, Eek could not find a way to enter Silafarn, and could only sneak in from the north of Tosankate Forest, which wasted a lot of time. But, this time Brando convinced Cohen and the others to open the gates for them. Silafarn's hills were now under their control, and they could secretly place an army under the Bloodstaff's nose at any time. But it was at this time that Eek encountered trouble. According to the original plan, Duke Vero and Lantern Island's allied army would wait for Tanajal's army to arrive before launching an attack on the Blood Staff. But there were still a few hours before the attack, and Duke Vero's knight subordinates were beginning to lose their patience. Eek had yet to figure out what was going on, but Makarov and the rest had already realized the problem. Vero was the first to speak. Duke Vero's subordinates obviously treated the Blood Staff as fish on the chopping board. They felt that Count Tanajal's purpose in proposing this battle plan was purely to share the credit with them. The reason was simple. Lantern Island's army and Duke Vero's army were almost twice the size of the Bloodstaff's army, and it was well known that the undead army's individual combat ability was inferior to that of a human's. Human's army was known to be weak. It was only in a situation where the difference in military strength was twice that of Trenthium's. Furthermore, it was an unintentional scheme, so there was no need to wait for Trenthium's army to arrive. Therefore, as soon as the Bloodstaff's army entered their field of vision, these local lords and knight lords began to get restless. When Makarov and the others told this to Eek, this knight fanatic suddenly had a headache. He never dreamed that such a situation would occur. In fact, it was not only him, even Brando himself did not expect this. Brando only remembered the ambush in history, but he forgot that the Erwin nobles of this era were not the same nobles that Princess Griffin built a decade later. It was the army that he and Freya had built after the Rising Kingdom. More importantly, the Anthony Alliance was actually led by Eiko in history. But this time, because of his and Her Royal Highness's intervention, Duke Vero had sent out far more troops than in history. So now on the battlefield, it was very doubtful that Eiko's words still counted. One had to know that this was not a normal army but an alliance of nobles. Usually, when dukes fought, there were often cases of their retainers acting on their own, let alone an alliance of two dukes. In fact, when the news was passed to Eek, Duke Vero's knight lords had already begun to move. P.S. 2 updates for the first day posted together. Please vote. Day 1. Chapter 865. After witnessing the Lord's hospitality in Valhalla, little Pero no longer doubted who was the most powerful person in Erewhon. While everyone else was surprised by the magnificent scenery of Valhalla, he kept an eye out. His mind had always been more flexible, so he could notice that the elven girls in charge of receiving them were the most outstanding archers among the tree elves. He also noticed that the officers of the White Lion Guards who came and went wore magic armor. This was definitely not the kind of power that a local noble in a small country like Erewhon should have. He thought that those who opposed the Count were definitely genuine fools, especially those nobles in the north of Erewhon. They were all real good-for-nothings, a plate of loose sand not worth mentioning. This lord definitely had the ability to transform this small kingdom according to his wishes. At a glance, it was obvious that he was a man with great ambitions, and he definitely needed this group of people. But before he could speak, Aaliyah on the side spoke first. The guy pursed his lips as if he had been holding back this sentence for a long time, and if he did not say it as soon as possible, he would die in a moment. The Lord is out hunting. If you don't mind, you can invite guests, and we happen to be free to help you hunt a bear, an elk, or something in this forest. That damned reckless idiot. Little Pero wanted to kick Aaliyah, but privately he had to admit that the latter's straightforwardness was sometimes a good tactic. It's just that the crew's people have lost all their face because of him. Brando chuckled and replied in all seriousness, "As the host, I'm embarrassed to entertain guests with a few stinky bones. My lord, according to our crew's tradition, not all hunted prey are to be roasted on a bonfire. You can nail their heads on a wooden board and hang them in the room." Hang the stinky head of the blood staff in the room? I don't seem to have such a bad taste. Brando thought to himself, but it's about time you said that. He turned his gaze to little Perrault on the side, understanding that this young man was the one who had a say in this group of knights. Of course, there was also Lenorette, who had a tacit attitude. However, the eldest prince had been living in seclusion during this period of time and rarely left the camp. He was like a noble daughter who was afraid of being exposed to the light. Little Perrault lowered his head. "My lord, the bear and elk definitely won't be able to escape from your grasp, but I think the hunters may still have some problems." "Hunter?" "My lord, in winter, hunters often invite their friends and family when they hunt together. They also try to choose experienced hunters because everyone wants to be the first to shoot the best prey. Young people are impatient and will often alert the enemy." Brando's heart skipped a beat. He had already realized what the other party wanted to say. He frowned and said, "Continue." "My lord, I've studied some of Cruz's early war history. Apart from the war between the Holy Sanctum, most of the wars between the lords below are relatively simple and full of variables. It's not that they don't want to arrange a delicate plan to defeat their opponents in one fell swoop, but most of the lords know what their subordinates and retainers are like. Their actions are often influenced by hot-headedness or superfluous fear. They often act in private and destroy the overall situation. Therefore, the wars between the territories are often about who makes fewer mistakes." Little Perrault was just short of saying that his plan was an armchair strategy. Brando's face turned red. Fortunately, it was not obvious in the misty rain. In the past, the battles he commanded were carried out by professional players. The so-called gap in execution and discipline of the players was compared to the modern army. But for the aristocratic army of this era, it could be called a model. In the Amber Sword, even the players of small and medium-sized guilds were comparable to the White Lion Legion in terms of discipline and execution. The large guilds were even more so. After all, as long as the orders were not unreasonable or restricted personal freedom, most players would not go against their own guild points. These memories of the past created an illusion that made him almost forget that it was neither the players who were cooperating with him now, nor the disciplined White Lion Legion, but the Duke's private army that even the Southern Legion and the Vermeer Legion could not compare to. These armies were mostly a motley army composed of 7 or 8 lords and their knight and attendants. It would be strange if there were no problems. His thinking had been affected by the stereotype in the game, and he had almost forgotten about this matter. Fortunately, little Perrault and the others were the most professional soldiers at this time, and had received good training in military history and battlefield analysis. They could see the loopholes in his arrangement at a glance. He could not help but look at the thin young man again. The other party did not say any nonsense, and just a sentence of analysis established their position in his mind. It seems that letting these folded sword knight join this battle was the right choice, Brando thought to himself. As expected of the future generals of the Cruz people, they are not inferior to the rumors at all. At least this deal has not been a loss so far. The current situation is already like this. How can we remedy it? My lord, there is no need to remedy it. The situation on Madara's side is no better than ours. Even this military operation is the product of a moment of hot-headedness for Madara. The blood staff brought in the Dark Lords of the Sea of the Dead Moon, but those lords are no different from our lords. Their army is also full of hot-headed and wrong judgments. This battle is still equal for both sides, not to mention that we have the initiative, and our military strength is far superior to those skeletons. Victory is inevitable in my opinion. Brando calmed down and realized this. What little Perrault said earlier was just to remind him not to take things for granted, and at the same time highlight their role. My lord, we are more concerned about where you intend to use us. You are not suitable to appear on the main battlefield for the time being, but right now there is a place where you can be of use. If those lords really act rashly and alert the enemy, it is inevitable that an army will be needed to go around the back of the Bloodstaff army and delay the skeleton's advance. Little Perrault looked at the Count Tonagel with some appreciation, thinking that this was also a smart man and understood what he meant at once. However, they also had their own pride and replied faintly, My lord, the Bloodstaff army will not be able to move a step, not be delayed. So these are Cruz's people. Brando thought to himself. However, It was not impossible for a group of knights with average strength above the gold rank and as many as hundreds of people to block the Bloodstaff's retreat. Don't make too much of a ruckus. I will arrange the position to look like the White Lion guards under my lord, and we will evacuate first before the others arrive. Brando smiled. It was easy to talk to smart people. He looked at the folded sword knight present and could not help but feel a little pity. How nice would it be if these people were Erwin's people? Do you want to find a way to make them stay? This thought suddenly flashed through his mind, but then he shook his head. This problem was too special. For little Pero and the others, if they lost their sense of glory as soldiers, they would not be able to grow into real generals in the future. Forget it, let's take one step at a time. Besides, it's not like there aren't any geniuses among Erwin's people. After receiving a positive answer from Brando, the folded sword knights, who had been depressed for a month, seemed to have been rejuvenated. These young knights were all full of energy. How could they be idle? After learning that they could go into battle to kill the enemy, they could not help but rejoice. The preparation work of little Pero, Brund, and Aaliyah was also going very smoothly. In fact, the folded sword knights had been a string taut all this time, waiting for Brando's final answer from top to bottom, so there was actually no need to prepare at this time. In just half an hour, everyone was ready to go. Of course, this also showed that these young people from Cruz were well trained. If they were placed in the ordinary noble cavalry, even if they were prepared in advance, it would take at least an hour or two to finally get ready. At this time, Freya arrived at Brando's army under the escort of several Highland knights. The arrival of the Valkyrie brought bad news to Brando. Sure enough, as little Pero expected, Duke Viro's retainers hurriedly launched an attack before Brando arrived. After she learned the news from Eek, she immediately went ahead to inform Brando. According to Freya, in order to cooperate with Viro's army, Anthony's army and the Highland Knights had also launched an attack one after another. Now the battlefield between the two sides was unfolding in the middle of the Silafan Hills and was in a fierce battle. After she finished speaking, she could not help but look at Brando's face, thinking that he would be furious, but she did not expect Brando to just smile bitterly and shake his head as if he had expected it. Freya, go and get ready, the White Lion guards are waiting for the order to attack. Medisha will cooperate with you. This is the first real war for Tanajal's army. I will also leave the Wind Archers under your command. Brando? Both Viro and Anthony's armies have moved. We must also speed up to cooperate with them. If they want to suffer, then let them. But is this okay? It's okay, the Bloodstaff can't win, it's just that some people will suffer a big loss. On the contrary, Freya, this is the first battle after the White Lion Guards and the Wind Archers formed an army. I hope they can leave a deep impression on all the enemies of this kingdom. All the enemies? Brando nodded. In his heart, those rotten vines and rotten branches that blocked the path of this kingdom, they were about to be swept away. Erwin would usher in a new life from this moment on. The saplings planted in Tanajal were finally about to sprout and take root. This battle began on a gentle slope to the west of Silafarvan Hills. The whole slope was east-west, and there was a dense linden forest on the hillside. As early as a day ago, a noble knight from Viro had brought his attendants to this forest to ambush. This knight named Planchet was neither a confidant of Duke Viro, nor an important retainer of the Duke. Strictly speaking, he was just an insignificant person. He came from the barren territory of the tranquil wind forest, a truly poor person. He only came to this muddy water for two purposes. The first was for money, and the second was to enter the eyes of the Duke. In order to realize this ambition, he sold his family's wealth and pulled up this group of people. For the first time in his life, he rode a horse, wore a set of tailor-made leather armor, painted the emblem on the shield, raised the flag and followed the army to Silafarvan, a place even poorer than his hometown. However, although Planchet was greedy for money and fame, he was not a hot-headed young man. Before he came, he had inquired clearly that this expedition was to deal with the skeletons of Madara. The legend of those skeletons could be talked about for 3 days and 3 nights. During the First War of the Black Rose, there was even an army of Madara that entered the Viro province along the Erect Mountains. Although Planchet had never seen these terrifying opponents, he had heard of their ferocity from various sources. Before he really made up his mind to go all out, this knight also thought about it again and again, but in the end, a bold plan formed in his heart. He did not know where he heard a legend, but it was said that the skeletons of Madara were controlled by liches. As long as the liches were killed, the skeletons would naturally lose their ability to fight. The liches themselves did not have much combat power, so once they were attacked from the back, they would be like fish on a chopping board. This way Planchet had a plan in his heart. He wondered why he did not hide, wait for the skeletons to pass by, and then rush out to slaughter the weak liches. In the end he could effortlessly obtain a great merit. Although this knight did not know a word in his life, he was very satisfied with his plan. He felt that he might be the kind of person who was born with the ability to command. Although the Bloodstaff army had not arrived yet, he could already see the scene of him being conferred the title of Marquis in the future. However, when Planchet arrived in Silipharn, he realized that there seemed to be some differences between his ideal and reality. First of all, it started to rain in the hills during autumn, which brought a lot of trouble to the army stationed in the forest. Including this knight, they had to march in a wet environment every day. Their feet were muddy and they felt like they had rolled in the mud every evening. But the saddest thing was that they did not even have a dry and comfortable place to sleep. Sometimes they could only wrap themselves in a cloak and sleep in the mud for the whole night. Planchet had experienced this before. In just 2 or 3 days he was complaining incessantly like the others. He almost cursed the heavens and the earth. Fortunately, half a week after the rain started, the army finally entered the designated ambush area. But unfortunately, Planchet realized that the situation in front of him was somewhat different from what he imagined. In his imagination, the so-called ambush was to hide in the valleys on both sides and wait for the Bloodstaff army to pass by. Then they would suddenly attack and cut off the skeletons from the middle. Of course, he would hide at the back and wait to kill the liches that were the easiest to deal with. But when he arrived in Silipharn, this knight realized that it was not the case at all. The entire battlefield was bigger than he imagined. At a glance, there were only undulating mountains, continuous hillsides and connected forests. He couldn't see the road at all, let alone distinguish the direction. In such a situation, Planchet felt that it would be difficult for him to even figure out the direction of Madara's army, let alone go around to the back and kill the liches. At this time the big shots began to divide the area one by one. Then they designated the scattered knight and lord to be stationed in their own ambush area. Planchet was divided into such a linden forest. That was fine. But Planchet had always been optimistic. In such a situation he was still able to figure out the situation around him. He soon found that most of the people stationed around him were poor like him. They were ambitious and wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to make a fortune. This discovery made him feel great pressure. Before this, he always thought that he was one of a kind, or rather, a person with an adventurous spirit who dared to seize the opportunity to rise to the top. But he didn't expect that there were so many people who were as bold as him. So he immediately began to feel pressed for time. Fortunately, this morning he was received by a big shot. Of course, it was with the other knight. But this was enough to make Planchet pay attention because it was said that the big shot was an important minister of Duke Viro. Of course, the content of the meeting was probably to raise their vigilance because the Bloodstaff army had already made contact with the scouts of Viro's army early yesterday. But with his innate sensitivity, Planchet heard another meaning from the other party's words. It was a tacit agreement that they were allowed to attack without orders at the right time, and they didn't have to wait for a predetermined time to launch an attack. This was because the big shot also said that opportunities on the battlefield were fleeting, and the outstanding knight had to learn how to seize them. Of course, if Planchet had some military knowledge he would understand that this was just nonsense. If Brando was here he would probably sneer at the Viro nobles for being so obvious in order to gain merit. But almost everyone believed that victory was in sight, and a little indulgence didn't seem to be a bad thing. Of course this had nothing to do with Planchet. He only felt that this was a good omen no matter what. And this good omen didn't stop. This afternoon he finally saw a small group of skeleton knight running through the linden forest. Following closely behind this skeleton cavalry was an army of skeletons. There were about a few hundred skeletons in this army, but of course, Planchet couldn't count them. He only felt that he had never seen so many undead. They were densely packed on the hillside. This must be the army of the undead. He was extremely nervous, but a thirst for merit and money calmed him down, as if overcoming his fear. He felt his heart pounding. The opportunity he had been dreaming of was right in front of him. Sure enough, after a while, he saw a group of skeletons wearing robes and holding staffs in their hands appear in his field of vision. If he was familiar with the army of Madara, he would definitely recognize that these were the skeleton wizards who cast detection spells in the vanguard and were responsible for supporting the scouts. But for Planchet they only had one identity. Necromancers. The opportunity is here. Planchet secretly said to himself. Chapter 866. Planchet did not understand that he might be able to change the outcome of a war. If he understood this, he would have felt extremely honored. Less than a quarter of an hour after the battle in Silafarvan began, Viro's Night Lords were the first to feel that something was wrong. In fact, it would be abnormal if they did not feel that something was wrong. When the knight named Planchet recklessly led his attendants out of the linden forest and charged towards a large group of skeleton mages, of course he thought they were necromancers. The battle in Silafarvan was destined to slide in a direction that they did not expect. Planchet's action was like a signal to the night boys to hurry up and fight for the credit that belonged to them. Although no one blew the horn, it was as if the horn had suddenly sounded. All the knights who were lying in ambush in that area screamed and rushed to attack Planchet. In this way, this action instantly affected the entire left wing of Viro's army. Before their commanders had time to react, they found that the front wing of the army had been completely disconnected. Everyone could not help but be stunned at that moment. In order to get rid of the troops from other areas and fight for credit, they more or less hinted to their subordinates that they could take the initiative to attack under tacit consent and did not have to wait for the predetermined time. But the problem was that it seemed to be too early. The supreme commander of Viro's army was only stunned for a moment before he could not help but curse. "Who?" he roared. "Whose subordinate is that?" Everyone around him was silent at this moment because Planchet had indeed chosen a good time, so good that even the Bloodstaff's army had not really entered the encirclement of Viro's army. The sudden attack also stunned the undead. The Dark Lords from the Sea of the Dead Moon reacted quickly and steadied themselves almost immediately. They thought that since the humans were prepared, the skeleton army in the vanguard would definitely be destroyed. They immediately gave up on the skeleton army and retreated to prevent the human army from attacking their main force. However, these experienced dark mercenaries were surprised to find that the human knights did not seem to notice them at all. Instead, they excitedly charged towards the vanguard. Of course, their first reaction was not to think that the left wing of the human army would break off and attack their vanguard. Instead, they thought that the vanguard was just a bait. If they dared to go forward to support the vanguard or let the vanguard retreat, the main force of the human army hidden in the surrounding hills would appear and give them a heavy blow. This was a logical thought. After all, no one would expect their opponent to suddenly go crazy, although the truth could sometimes be so absurd. But at this moment, the Bloodstaff could not help but be a little stunned. The enemy is not the vanguard? But where did this human army come from? Of course, if the Bloodstaff only saw the knight as a wing of Viro's army, then the number of this army was still acceptable. But the problem was that the Bloodstaff and the Dark Lords under it had a preconceived notion that this was just the vanguard of the human army. This vanguard bait had more than 2,000 people, so wouldn't the human army that was lying in ambush here be more than 20 to 30,000 people? No matter how hard the Bloodstaff racked its brains, it could not figure out where these damned Erewhon people had gathered so many people. Of course, that was if it still had brains to rack. The hesitation of the undead army in Viro's eyes had another meaning. The Bloodstaff's army now had about 1,000 skeleton warriors on the surface, and a third of this number were skeleton archers. In addition, there was also a large number of skeleton cavalry, the latter were mercenaries from the Sea of the Dead Moon. These were basically all its forces, plus hundreds of dreadlings as well as some ghosts, zombies and other miscellaneous undead, but they were not large. And now, the vanguard of this undead army was under the attack of Erewhon's people. The vanguard was only made up of a few hundred skeleton warriors, a few dozen skeleton wizards who were in charge of casting detection spells, and a few teams of skeleton cavalry scouts. With such a small number of people, they had pinned down the entire left wing of Viro's army. This result made all the commanders on Viro's side feel at a loss. If the undead commanded the army to charge over at this time, Viro's army would probably collapse completely from the left wing in an instant. Countless people were cursing the recklessness of the knights below. Although they also wanted to abandon Brando and fight for this glory and credit alone, they did not expect the knights below to be even more anxious than them. Before the Bloodstaff's army entered the encirclement, those damned fellows had already launched a charge in advance. At this moment, these commanders immediately experienced the helplessness that Brando had experienced earlier. However, just when they thought that this time they were bound to fail miserably, Madara showed a very cautious attitude. The skeletons were obviously shrinking their defense, as if they were going to give up on their vanguard. Everything in front of them was simply a blessing from the heavens for the commanders of Viro's army. They could not help but feel a little suspicious. What were these skeletons doing? After all, the lords under Grand Duke Viro were not really stupid. They quickly guessed Madara's thoughts, but even if they guessed it, no one dared to act rashly. They could only watch the entire left wing kill the enemy's vanguard, praying that those idiots would realize the current situation and quickly withdraw after taking advantage of the situation. Of course, on the other hand, they also prayed that Martha would bless them so that those damned skeletons would not see through any flaws. They did not dare to send more men to help the left wing. They did not even dare to move. The skeletons of Madara thought that they had also sent out the vanguard. Once the other troops were exposed, the enemy would realize their arrangement no matter how stupid they were. By then it would all be over. Grand Duke Viro's supreme commander could not help but sweat. He never dreamed that the battle would reach this point. He could only quickly order the private noble army lying in ambush on the main line and the right wing to quickly adjust their direction, just in case the left wing was defeated. At least they could still hold on. On the one hand, he was also silently praying that Anthony's army could catch up with their pace and join the battle. Madara had nearly 10,000 troops, while Viro and Anthony's coalition had a total of 15,000 men. If Anthony's army could join the battle in time, the situation would not be as dangerous as it was now. But what made him feel bitter was that it was precisely because they had previously abandoned Anthony and Tanajal's army and acted on their own that they were now in such a dilemma. At this moment, His Excellency could not help but feel that they had brought this upon themselves. So at this moment, there was a strange balance on the battlefield. Both sides of the battle were praying for a miracle. Viro's side hoped that Madara would not be so quick to see through their low-level mistakes, while Bloodstaff was anxious to find out who was ambushing them and how many human troops were in front of them. According to the judgment of the Dark Lords, there was at least an army of more than 20,000 men in front of them. If this judgment was true, Bloodstaff could only pray for a miracle so that his army could escape from this hill. At this moment he actually had a kind of understanding in his heart. The army in front of him was probably from Viro or Anthony. However, what happened next left everyone dumbstruck. The knight's charge was in progress. The meadow on the hillside was like a light blue wave. This wave was moving forward. The most glorious moment of Planchet's life was probably at this moment. He was riding on a horse, holding a shield high and a long spear in his hand. Although he was staggering all the way and his horsemanship was almost unsightly, in any case he was the one who led the army to launch the attack. With thousands of men and horses following behind him, he was like the tip of the sharp spear. At this moment he finally understood what the knight's so-called glory was all about. This was glory. He could not help but shout, as if his voice alone could make these liches in front of him to disarm and surrender. He felt that he was in the limelight at this moment, and he must have entered the eyes of those important people. He was the first knight to launch an attack, and he was about to bring a glorious victory to Viro. This time he would definitely become an important minister by the Grand Duke's side. Of course, Planchet would never have dreamed that the real important minister by Grand Duke Viro's side, the supreme commander of Viro's army, would definitely cut him into pieces if possible. However, Planchet was unaware of this. He was still immersed in the romance of the night. He suddenly felt that he had lived the first half of his life in vain, and this moment was the life he really wanted. For this moment he felt that even if he died right away it would be worth it. Perhaps Martha felt his desire and was willing to give him a push from behind to help him achieve his ultimate goal in life. All in all, in the eyes of Master Planchet, the liches were like fish on the chopping board. They shouldn't be able to put up any resistance at all. As long as he slaughtered his way into their midst, these damned skeletons would turn into ashes like clay chickens and pottery dogs. If it were a human army, perhaps they would have been scared witless and pissed their pants by now. However, contrary to Planchet's expectations, the skeletons immediately raised their staffs. At that moment he felt that he might have been deceived. Another of Master Planchet's dreams was to become a wizard, having heard the bards speak of their prowess in the bars. Until the last moment of his life, he finally witnessed the beauty of magic with his own eyes. In fact, it was not that beautiful. The skeleton mage pointed at him from afar. Planchet barely had any time to react. Half of his body swelled up and exploded into a cloud of blood mist with a bang. This death was not a perfect ending for the knight, but for the others, it was just the beginning of the horror. This shocking way of dying stunned all the attendants who followed Planchet. A living person exploded into a pile of minced meat right in front of them, and the blood and organs splattered all over the people behind them. Even a real professional soldier might not be able to withstand such a shock, let alone these so-called nobles who were temporarily pulled up by the so-called nobles. Thus, it was only natural that these attendants would break down at the first moment. Their minds were in a mess. The only thought they could think of was to turn around and run. Then they collided with the knight behind them. The center of the battlefield was suddenly in chaos. Then, the skeleton mage's black magic exploded in the human army one after another. Most of the knights were at Planchet's level. They had long heard from various sources that the undead were just SOSO. As long as they could overcome their fear, the undead were not even as good as human soldiers. It seemed to be true. In fact, many people set foot on the battlefield with this mentality, but the problem was that they soon found the gap between their ideals and reality. They realized that overcoming their fear did not seem to be an easy task. Even the leading knight was scared out of his wits, let alone the attendants behind him. The braver ones simply pulled the reins of their war horses and went around the two sides of Madara's vanguard. Some of these people were lucky enough to survive. The less courageous ones turned around in a flurry, and most of them collided with their own men. One must know that the battlefield had a certain slope, and the result of such collisions could be imagined. A large number of knights were thrown off their war horses and fell to the ground. Then their comrades who were not good at riding trampled over them. It was a horrible sight to behold. There were also some who were completely terrified and directly charged into the army of skeletons. However, the problem was that there were too few of them. The small number of skeletons that charged into the army of skeletons were impaled on the spears and used as an example to others. Just like that. In less than 10 minutes, the entire left wing of Viro's army was completely defeated by the undead, who were less than a quarter of their number. Or rather, they were completely defeated by themselves. Of course, this was not because the quality of Viro's private army was really bad. On the one hand, it was because their commander made a mistake. He was afraid that the knights from all over the country would drag the Duke's private army down, so he gathered them all on the left wing. Of course, his original intention was that the left wing seemed to be easier to fight because of the terrain. But he never dreamed that these damn guys would be so undisciplined and rush out on their own. Not only did they rush out, but they also inexplicably collapsed. Of course, this was also because most of the local armies in Viro had never fought against Madara before. It was just like how the Vermeer army was defeated by the undead army in the First War of the Black Roses. That was not a reflection of their true fighting strength, but the natural fear of the undead that the humans had towards them. But in any case, the current result was a death sentence for the supreme commander of Viro's side. No matter how weak their left flank was, the destruction of the entire left flank, exposing one side of their army to the enemy's attacks, had already announced the final outcome of this war. The important minister of Duke Viro stood there in a daze, his forehead full of cold sweat. At this time, on Madara's side, whether it was the Blood Staff or the Dark Lords under him, they were also stunned. A moment ago they were still praying that they could escape from this ambush, but what happened next was like a clumsy comedy that inexplicably played out in front of them. The vanguard of the human army that took the initiative, came prepared and had several times more numbers than them, but it was actually defeated just like that. What kind of show was this? The Dark Lords under the Blood Staff looked at each other. They came from the cruel battlefield at the border of the Sea of the Dead Moon, and both sides of the war were veterans who had been on the battlefield for a long time. Few people on the battlefield would make such a low-level mistake. When they saw this scene, according to their instincts, the first thing that came to their mind was not that the humans opposite them were joking, but that this was not a terrible trap. Imagine a trap that required the sacrifice of 1,000 or 2,000 of their own people. The ultimate goal must be to wipe them all out. If these Dark Lords could still sweat, they must be drenched in cold sweat like the supreme commander of Viro. But among everyone, only the Blood Staff reacted first. It had interacted with these Erwin the most and knew some of their natures very well. It almost immediately realized that there was a problem. Of course, it was always cautious and did not immediately rescue its vanguard. Instead, it waved its staff and sent a command to the back. And at the same moment when it gave the command, dozens of Dreadwraiths flew out from the undead army and flew toward the Erwin's position in front of them. If the supreme commander of Viro's side had a last glimmer of hope before this, but after seeing the terrifying flying undead with wings that were several meters wide, he immediately understood that it was all over this time. Madara would soon find out what was going on in front of them. Imagine an army that had lost a wing and could not be gathered back in a short period of time. What kind of scene would it be if they were exposed in front of the enemy's main army? Moreover, the enemy had skeletal cavalry, and they did not even have a chance to escape. If there was any hope in the Supreme Commander's heart at this moment, it was that the Anthony army that they had left behind and the Tanajal army under the command of the Count could quickly appear on the battlefield, the sooner the better. P.S. Everyone who follows, likes and supports this book, have a happy weekend. The second chapter is here. May I ask for monthly votes, by the way? You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.